You just want me to start it like normal?
Yeah, go for it.
This week on the Frame Savers, it's me, Mario. Nailed it.
Absolutely nailed it. So welcome everybody
First
who's
try.
watching on Speed Gaming 3 right now. We're going to mostly just jump right into it. We're going to take our short breaks where we typically take our short breaks, but this is our first live episode on Speed Gaming, and I just wanted to say hi to you guys, and we'll say hi even more now that we're transitioning into our opening segment. So go for it.
Nailed it. You really explained that good. This is episode 60 of the Frame Savers. If you are new to the podcast, we are a retro video game podcast that focuses on speedrunning. Speedrunning is a hobby where we try and beat video games as quickly as possible using whatever means possible. And this week we were talking about a juggernaut in the speedrunning community, Super Mario 64. But before we dive into that, Chad, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I've been playing like a lot of games, and I've been excited to play even more. But unfortunately, now with the Christmas break coming up and my semester being over, and then leaving town, I'm quickly becoming aware of the fact that I'm going to have to go through my typical speedrunning withdrawals, where I'm away from my consoles for like 2 weeks, and it's not going to
You
be
can
pretty.
bring the Switch on the go. Did you know that? It is a portable system and a console system.
Wait, I have it hooked up to my television. Are you telling me
Yeah.
that I could literally just bring that anywhere I
You
wanted
could
to?
disconnect it from your television. It has a battery life of like 14 to 18 minutes, and you can play all kinds of games. It's
That's
awesome.
just enough time to get in one round of Golf Story.
Yeah, exactly. So, what have you been speedrunning, man?
I've been speedrunning Kid Cool a lot more. So for those of you who've been
Cool.
listening to
Good for you.
episodes of the podcast, that's like 4 episodes running, and I've been getting a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails asking me, "Hey man, are you all right?" And yes, I'm doing okay. I promise. I'm in a safe place.
The Department of Health called you. I thought that was weird.
Yeah, it
It
was a little bit
seems a little bit
strange.
out of their jurisdiction, but
I've
yeah.
got a pretty good time in it. I'm probably gonna go for it a little bit further, but I'm trying to move on. But the game keeps just dragging me back in.
It's a
What
good
have
one.
What have you been up to lately?
So I did my episode on the Adventures of Star Saver, which is a little known Game Boy game that I routed and was doing. Other than that, the only runs I've done since then are Final Fantasy VII, and boy howdy, let me tell you, there's nothing better than running a game for about 5, 6 hours and then making a mistake, and that's it, and it's over, and then you just go to bed or something. So it's been real great. It's a real fun game, but yeah, no, I have like an hour to save between my time and Summer Best, so I'm trying to get my sub 9 hour, and then we'll see. I got some Game Boy games on the horizon. I'm trying to route and run a bunch of new Game Boy games that have no runs on them. So the first one was Star Saver, and I've got some others in a list. I want to just contribute to the Game Boy community by doing an initial run of a bunch of games. So I'm
These
excited
gems are
for
just
that.
coming in. They're falling off the shelves, literally off of
Yeah,
your shelves, and you're picking them
yeah.
up and saying, "Let's do a speed run of this one."
Yeah, and so I hopefully will do the next one soon. But yeah, I'm excited about that. We are actually doing this episode live. We didn't say on Speed Gaming, twitch.tv/speedgaming3. They're so big, Speed Gaming. They've taken over all of Twitch. They have to have multiple channels. They've got Speedrunning the Ocho. They've got Speedrunning Deportes. They got a lot of stuff, so definitely check them out. We've got some cool upcoming events too, right?
Yeah, so before we jump into talking a little bit about why we picked Super Mario 64, why we're talking about this, really underwhelming, lesser known game, first we need to plug just a few events really quickly. So first off, we've got a little event called Awesome Games Done Quick coming up pretty soon. So that's an event supporting the Prevent Cancer Foundation running from January 7th to the 14th. And you can find that on twitch.tv/gamesdonequick. It's, 7 days, 24 hours, actually around the clock runs from, some of the best and brightest and handsomest people in the community, playing video games for your pleasure or displeasure, however your taste may lie.
And I hear you have a run in that event.
I will.
Everybody is awaiting. Everybody's so excited for.
So they don't know it yet, but I'm going to jump in anytime I can find 5 minutes of downtime, and I'm just going to play Titanic really quickly before anyone catches me or stops me. That's the plan.
That'll be really cool. That'll clearly be during the Awful Games block, I assume. I hope.
Yeah.
We also have on here on the Speed Gaming channel a link to the past All Dungeons community race. This is following in the footsteps of Get Yourself Speedrunning. If you don't know what that is, it's generally an event that tries to encourage people to get into speedrunning, learn a new game, etc. Usually following GDQ. So there is a pace spin that you can find, but go to the Speed Gaming channel. That'll be on January 27th, so after GDQ, at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Go check that out, learn it. Link to the Past is a cool game. All dungeons means that you have to beat all the dungeons, but you can still go out of bounds and do a bunch of glitches to get to those dungeons. So I don't know this particular category, but it's
Yeah,
probably
we'll
pretty
be
cool.
when we post this episode, we'll post the pace bin that was provided to me. They've been organizing this for a little while, and the pace bin's really great because it explains the rules, what you need to know when it's happening, and also just sort of a rundown for some resources you can use to learn the game. So it's really supposed to get people interested in one of the less common categories in the game. So hopefully that's a good way for more people to get interested and acclimated into A Link to the Past. And I think that understanding that category well will probably give you a lot of the tools you need if you really want to get into some of the more esoteric glitched randomizer categories as well, if you want to jump into
Definitely.
that. So we're talking about Super Mario 64 today, and we've been very fortunate to be able to be joined by BlueBob. So hey, how are you doing, bud?
Hello, I'm great.
So
Hope you
what
guys are
have
doing
you been up to lately?
well, you see, my resume is a little bit different than your guys. You guys run lots of games. I've been running the same game, Super Mario 64, for almost 3 years now. It'll be 3 years in January. So
Awesome.
So
yeah,
what
you almost
attracted
always
you?
get the same answer out of me.
So what attracted you to Super Mario 64 initially?
So I played that game a ton as a kid. And then basically it was kind of the one game I came back to casually every once in a while. And then I stumbled across some games done quick VODs on YouTube. And then I eventually found Super Mario 64 and figured I'd try it myself, and then got hooked.
Awesome. Yeah, a lot of people can do one thing really well. I'd like to say that, specializing in doing a lot of things poorly is way more impressive, right?
Yeah,
I
that's
would
what I
agree
tell
with you.
myself.
Yeah. What was your initial, I guess, intro into SM64, Mr. Chad?
Oh well, I mean I've said before on the podcast, my intro to speedrunning in general was actually, I think as the same for a lot of people, was Siglimic's summer of 120 star. Through 2013 in August, he was doing 12 hours of attempts per day, every single day for 30 days straight, and I think a lot of people sort of looked on in awe and realized, I could do that too for the game that I want to play.
That's over 50 hours total, I think,
Yeah,
on
it's a
that
lot of
stream.
it's a lot of numbers all added together. And I think this is one game that we're on episode. This is episode 60 of the podcast. We've shied away from this game for a really long time, and to be honest, one of the reasons for that is that this game is really just sort of a pillar of the speedrunning community. It represents such a large percentage of the speedrunning community, and it really is one of those games that when you talk to people about speedrunning, this is one of those games that you would want to refer people to because it just sort of represents that really central figure to our community. I mean, there's obviously going to be people who disagree, this game or that game is the most important one in speedrunning,
Mhm.
but this game just represents something really special, I think.
Yeah, if there were a speedrunning Mount Rushmore, which would be really cool if there were, it would cost a lot of money probably. I assume Mount Rushmore costs a lot of money. It'd probably be like this and Super Metroid, maybe SMB1, some other stuff, but this is definitely one of the top four kind of pillars of speedrunning. For me, I mean, I got this game when it came out on the N64, and I remember I was blown away. Like, literally remember sitting there saying, "There's no way graphics get better than this," which is very funny to think of now. Like, it's not like they were especially realistic looking graphics, but I was just being able to play Mario in a 3D environment was just so awesome. Trying to get all 120 stars casually, which I did, and then I mean, I even remember Nintendo Power back in the day would have like people send in screenshots of what's the most number of coins you've gotten in this level and trying to like oh, this guy got all the coins, he got 124. You didn't have game facts or things to look up on the internet to figure out where everything was, so it was really just a cool challenge, so much depth and so much fun. Just blew my mind from moving from SMW, which is obviously a great game as well, but this is just a whole different experience.
Yeah, for sure. When I got my first Nintendo 64, I got it for Christmas, and I got this game and Ocarina of Time at the same time. So I guess I probably didn't get my Nintendo 64 when it first came out, but I remember being mesmerized by both of those games, and it's just like you said, you sort of look at those and you're like, wow, this is the best it's ever going to get, and they just did not age handsomely, to be
Yeah,
perfectly honest.
I mean, it's telling of how good this game is, though, and the fact that this was basically the only game the system launched with. I think it was this and Pilot Wing 64, and like people weren't complaining. Like that's all people needed was SM64, and it was awesome. We also have a tournament coming up on Speedgaming, a 70-star tournament, right?
Yeah, I think it's going right now. There's already been a few matches, if I'm not mistaken, for the 70-star tournament.
It started on December 1st.
Okay. Yeah, so it's been...
there's roughly 64 people in it.
That's...
And it starts off in like a group stage. So everyone's in groups of 4, and then you race each person from your group.
Right.
And then the top 2 from each group will move on. And then the tournament, I guess like the second phase will start in January.
So it's like the World Cup.
Awesome.
Almost,
you got your group play, you got your elimination tournament. Do games go to shootout at the end, or
they do not? They go to throws.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's probably for the best.
So definitely check that out. We're gonna go ahead and take a quick break. You're gonna hear some of that fresh SM64 music we all love, and then we're gonna hear from Professor Author Blues about this game.
So we're talking about Super Mario 64 today, and as a lot of you guys know, this game was developed and published by Nintendo. It was specifically developed by Nintendo EAD, which is also known as Research and Development 4. And it was released in June of 1996 in Japan and in September of 1996 in North America. It actually didn't even make it to Europe until 1997, which, I feel bad for Europe, but at some point, I mean, you're just kind of beating a dead
Europe
horse.
got the short end of the stick all the time with video games. So.
Yeah, but they got the opposite for Sega games. They got all of them early, and then North America had to sit on their hands for a while.
And they have good beer. So
it's
that's
true.
Good.
So R&D4, for those of you who aren't familiar with Nintendo's teams, EAD and R&D4 were responsible for handling some of the most important franchises such as Super Mario Brothers and Legend of Zelda. R&D1 was typically more focused on the portable and console development. So R&D1 was responsible for things like the Game Boy and the Virtual Boy, actual development of the consoles. And R&D4 is the team that you know from producing games like Super Mario Brothers and the Zelda games. This game was produced by Shigeru Miyamoto, and it was directed by a team made up of Miyamoto, and then his assistant directors were Yoshiaki Koizumi, who is best known for his work on Sunshine and the Galaxy series, and then also Takashi Tezuka, who is one of the major forces behind the very polished level design that the Mario series knows and loves as far back as the Super Mario Brothers. If you've listened to our podcast, I sing Tezuka's praises constantly because I'm a firm believer of Nintendo. Of Mario games having pretty much the most polished level design as far as teaching the player most effectively, and a lot of that goes down to Tezuka. He was responsible for a lot of that really, really stellar level design. And one of the things that makes this game really interesting by comparison to sort of modern standards is that this game was actually developed by a team of only 15 people. That sort of comparison between modern games where you have teams of hundreds and hundreds of people across different groups and teams and departments all sort of working together to build one product. It's kind of interesting when you look at games like this and realize that they were just built by a handful of people. There were plenty of NES games, going even further back, that were developed by just like 3 or 4 people working together.
Yeah.
And these days we can't even envision teams that small. So
and now there's like a guy that's just devoted to like creating people's noses. You're like,
Right.
I just work on the noses. That's all I work.
I made the hair.
Engineer.
I hope you like the hair.
It's crazy.
I wanted blonde, but the other guy went for auburn. So
Yeah, it was crazy. So in terms of development, I found a thing from our research. While developing Star Fox for the SNES in the early 90s, that's kind of when the idea of a 3D Mario game came to being in Nintendo, and they wanted to use the Super FX chip. So they speculatively titled this Super Mario FX, although in reality that's just an internal code they used. because they were going to use this Super FX chip. Ultimately, the idea was saved for the upcoming N64, which is similar to what happened with Star Fox 2. We did an episode on Star Fox 64, if you want to go back and listen to that. But essentially, instead of coming out with Star Fox 2 for the SNES, which is now on the SNES Mini, never was released, they scrapped it in favor of making a game on the Nintendo 64. And so development took 3 years for this game, with early focus just being on the camera. Ironically, I know that's a big complaint a lot of people have, but 3D cameras are hard, especially when, this is like one of the first 3D games, and character design. And it was originally positioned to release in Christmas of 1995, but Miyamoto asked for an additional couple of months because he thought that the game needed a little bit more polish, which was a big factor in delaying the N64's release until April of 96, which I think is really cool, honestly, because a lot of times, especially in modern gaming, games are rushed out, or can come out with, not being completely polished, and then they have to do updates and different things that they push. Obviously, you didn't have that back then. You sent out a cart, and that's the cart that people got, so it better work. But it's cool to see that they took the additional time to make sure they got it right. And Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi said, game creators can finish the games quickly if they compromise, but users have sharp eyes. They soon will know if the games are compromised. So and also, one interesting thing, they had looked into doing split screen cooperative play, but they eventually eliminated it because they couldn't make the gameplay work to their satisfaction. But it would be interesting to imagine playing an SM64 like with a split screen co-op. I don't know. I'm assuming on the same team co-op and not racing each other or what, but I don't know. That's an interesting concept.
Yeah, there's actually a ROM hack of Super Mario 64 that adds some of that functionality in. It's not like borrowed from the code or anything like that. I think someone actually hacked it in. It only works on emulator, but it's kind of interesting that someone actually has built multiplayer mods for this game. It's also really interesting, just like you mentioned, I didn't even think about that, but that would be pretty much unheard of in this day and age for a game or a console to be intended to be released during the holidays, and they say, oh, we need just a few more months.
Yeah.
I mean,
or a whole system actually.
Yeah, you push so hard for a game or a console to be released for the holidays because that big bump in sales, but it's like, why make a bad game?
Yeah, it's really cool that they made that sacrifice.
I guess one thing too is almost Nintendo's seems like they almost went back to that with like Breath of the Wild, for example, was supposed to come out like 2 years ago.
Yeah, for sure.
And it clearly paid off, just taking their time and making sure things were done right, and then they got Game of the Year, I believe. So.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of people get frustrated by pushbacks, but it's like, I mean, Breath of the Wild was perfect in my mind, so it's like well worth waiting the extra time if they're going to make it really great. So yeah, it beat out Odyssey for Game of the Year at the Game Awards, which is pretty cool. I've been told by people, Chad, I've been told that you should always respect the lore, that you got to always respect the lore. And so I want to know what the story is. I need to respect the lore before we dive into, the gameplay and all that stuff. What is the lore?
The manual goes into really weird detail for this game. Just so I don't know how many of you have read the Super Mario 64 manual, but for a game that's so utterly devoid of actual story, the game really tries hard to make it look like there is one under the hood. So the story behind this game is that Princess Peach writes a letter to Mario inviting him to the castle because she's baked a cake for him, but when he arrives, he discovers that Bowser has actually taken over the castle and imprisoned its servants using the power of the 120 stars. So Mario has to recover these stars to gain access to more areas in the castle where he eventually will face off against Bowser to rescue the princess. It's a tale as old as time.
Traveling all the way over there just to get some cake.
I know, you walk in the front door, you expect to be going over to your girlfriend's house, under the pretense of a cake, and you open the door and you hear a loud burly voice laughing at you. We've all been there.
Yep.
So
what's the gameplay like? I mean, I've never played this game.
Oh, you haven't? Well, I'll tell you a little bit about it. So before the levels were designed and created, Mario's movement and controls were originally refined with initial testing involving interacting with a golden rabbit named Mips, who eventually became an element in the finished game. So I've actually heard a lot of stories about the background behind this, and a lot of the versions usually center around whether this is true or not. A lot of the stories usually center around Miyamoto essentially saying, I just want to make a game where it's fun to run around, jump around, and catch this rabbit. Like if that part of the game by itself is fun, then the rest of the game is naturally going to be fun because of it. That, I mean, and that's not a joke. It's not meant to be like,
I mean,
he
if
was
you
so
can make catching a rabbit fun, you can make all the rest of the game
and
fun,
I think
right?
that was his goal. I think the idea was it should just feel fun and rewarding to control Mario, play around, jump around, go fast. And if you can do that, if the controls feel fluid, if it feels like you're not being held back, if that's fun, then the game is going to be fun. So that
I mean, I think
obviously
they did that with Odyssey as well. I mean, you make the movement fun, then you can make any part of the game fun. And I think the movement is the strength of Mario Odyssey and why people like it so much. And I think Mario 64 was the same. It had so many different moves and jumps than the previous Super Mario games did, all the 2D games. So, like, to be able to triple jump, to back jump, to side stuff, all these different things felt so unique and cool that, whatever it asked you to do was going to be more enjoyable.
Yeah. So just as an interesting piece of trivia, the name of the rabbit MIPS is actually a reference to the MIPS architecture processors that the Nintendo 64 used. So it was the code name for the processor and the architecture that was actually built into the Nintendo 64. So that's kind of where that came from. So this
I
game,
might disagree that it's fun catching the rabbit.
yeah,
What do you think, Blue Bob? Because it's really annoying to catch the stupid rabbit.
I was actually thinking, yeah, I was gonna say if that's the part that he was originally gonna base the game around, I think that's honestly the part that kind of made all the kids the angriest.
Yeah,
I feel like
rabbit
if he
was
just
a
wouldn't
slippery one.
I feel like if he wouldn't just juke you at the end of corners, like I think if you remove that and just chased him
Maybe they
around in a
didn't make
circle,
him Barry Sanders in his prime, and like you could actually get him. Goodness sakes!
it's amazing. They
crazy
actually
how-
covered him in a layer of oil.
It's crazy how easy it actually is to get him though when you understand him, because like he moves the same way every time. So like if you just get him to move, you know exactly where he'll be, and then you can just be there waiting pretty much.
Exactly.
But yeah, if you don't understand that, which obviously no one did as a kid, it was one of the more annoying things for sure.
For sure. So this game's split into 15 separate courses, which are separate worlds accessible through paintings or entrances. Miyamoto originally wanted more than twice as many, but ended up being limited by cartridge space issues. So when the game was originally presented at tech shows and conferences, he had envisioned 32 different worlds for which they had done quite a lot of planning, but no actual mapping for it yet. And once crunch time came along and they actually evaluated what cartridges they were going to put it on, they realized that it wasn't going to happen. So they ended up limiting it back to just 15 courses, where each course is a unique world that encourages free roaming without a timer. Each of them contains 6 stars, with the addition of a 7th star that's earned by collecting 100 coins within the span of 1 life. And most of these stars just involve challenges such as races, solving puzzles, reaching specific location, maybe beating a mini boss. The castle itself contains 15 secret stars that bring the total count of stars in the castle to 120.
120 stars.
Yep. So earning enough stars unlocks certain doors. Some of them lead to encounters with Bowser, who when beaten drops keys that unlock other areas of the castle. So it's sort of this give and take between trying to collect enough stars to get to Bowser, and then beating Bowser unlocks more courses for you to get more stars from. That's the general idea for that.
Yeah, and outside of the the new jumps that you could do compared to other Mario games, this didn't have all of the same power-ups that the old games had. It didn't have Fire Flower. It didn't have the feather or Tanuki suit or anything. But there were these wing caps, or these caps that were introduced that basically you'd have to unlock through different hidden areas in the game. And so there was a wing cap that lets you fly, which we can talk about later. I think the control in that is very frustrating, but it was really cool to be able to fly as Mario in a much more I guess real way than like flying in SMW. Like this is like actual kind of like you think about flying. There's a metal cap which makes you immune to most hazards and heavier, so you can sink to the bottom of water and such. And then the vanish cap, which lets you basically walk through certain types of barriers. So kind of introduce these 3 different power ups that didn't really get taken from previous games, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah. Actually, one of the things that they did originally want to carry over, but it actually made it into the game is Yoshi.
Mm-hmm.
I think their original plan there was to actually have you be able to ride Yoshi and acquire him in levels and stuff. But cool. I don't think it worked out too well. So they actually did put him in the game. After you collect 120 stars, Yoshi is actually on the roof of the castle.
Yep. I remember looking for him.
Yeah, and if you talk to him, he gives you 100 lives, and you also get an extended triple jump.
Wait, that actually affects your movement?
Yes. So your triple jump without it is just like your standard triple
I
jump.
never knew that.
Yeah. So after you get one where if you hold A through the triple jump, he just goes a little bit higher, but you lose
That's
the
crazy.
ability to actually wall kick from it.
Interesting.
There's so much going on there. There's so much to unpack. Now I'm curious, like, whether or not there's any reason why going up and talking to Yoshi by clipping on top of the castle early would have any benefit. Can you talk to him early if you can get up there?
Yoshi's not on the castle unless you have 120 stars.
Wow, they thought of everything, didn't they?
Yeah.
Those tricksters.
I just imagined he would be up there from the very start because they figured who the hell could it possibly get up there?
No, because I know obviously it takes 70 stars to get to the last Bowser and beat the game without major glitches.
My mind's blown.
If you watch the end credits, actually at the very end, they're all just like standing on the bridge waving, and like say if you beat it with 70 stars, Yoshi's not there, but if you beat it with 120 during the end credits, you'll see him chilling up on the roof.
So he only appears up there after 120 stars?
Yeah.
That's
Chad's mind's blown.
I'm learning so many things right now. Today is a big day for me.
Big day. Big day. So SM64 is also just a great example of a game that provides almost all abilities to the players from the start of the game and makes the controls fairly intuitive. So it promotes like organic discovery. And I think they do a good job of also like designing different stars to help you understand how to use those different mechanics as opposed to doing like a tutorial or something. It seems like the game naturally introduces you to certain mechanics. And you have dozens of different types of moves, including, you running, your triple jump, you've got diving, rolling, crawling, kicking, punching, back flipping, side flipping, wall jumping, long jumping, and more. There's just all kinds of different movement that you can do, which is, I think, makes the speedrun really interesting, but I think also is just really well done with the how it unfolds and teaches you how to do those things.
So I threw this in here. I wanted to talk about this.
Hot button topic.
Okay.
Hot
so here's the thing. I know that one of the things that a lot of people talk about the rare games, so things like Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64, they talk about how it took the Super Mario format, the Super Mario 64 format, and built on top of it. But I think one of the things that these games sort of get a little bit of pushback from is the fact that they're essentially collectathons. In a pretty significant way, the game just throws a billion collectibles in every single level, and while playing the game is still just as fun and rewarding, the objectives are a little bit looser. It's more about collecting enough of all of these objectives and sort of focusing on the miniature victories you get rather than the big victory of just picking up a star or something like that, beating a boss. And so my question is looking at it in that way and saying Super Mario 64 did it right because it wasn't a collectathon. Is it though? Because you still have to collect 100 coins in every single level if you want that 7th star, and ultimately you're still just collecting stars. So the question is
8 red coins.
8 red coins. So ultimately the question comes down to, why is Super Mario 64 not a collectathon, or why does it not get criticized for being a collectathon if it isn't one?
Am I going to start here?
Yeah, you're going to start here.
Okay. So I under like objective technical like semantic analysis, it is a collectathon. However, like to me, it's not a collectathon. It does not feel at all like a collectathon. It never did when I played it. And I don't know if that's my nostalgia goggles. I don't know if that's just the fact that I love this game, but I guess the way that does the different stars and objectives outside of collecting the 8 red coins and the 100 normal coins, if you're going for 120 stars, the rest of the objectives never felt exactly like a collectathon to me. Like Mario Odyssey is a collectathon much more so than this. I mean, you're collecting all the different outfits, you're collecting all the different moons, and they're like everywhere. Banjo-Kazooie has like 47,000 things to collect every level, and it's just random stuff like left throughout the level. It's like, go collect 200 feathers, collect 80 of this. This always felt a little bit more objective focused to me. I know there's not a lot of combat objectives, but there are a bunch of bosses to fight. There's a lot more like platforming objectives, like getting to places without dying. I don't know. To me, maybe it is a collectathon, but it's done in the way that I think it should be. So to me, it stands heads and shoulders above the other games people consider as collectathons, like Banjo-Kazooie or TK64 or any of those kind of games.
How about you, BlueBob? I'm gonna put you on the spot before I give the objectively right opinion.
Typical author blues. wants to make himself look more right, and also wants to go
Yeah.
last.
I mean, I've never been one to really criticize games for being collectathons, but I can see why people would think that. But at the same time, um, I think, like, obviously with the exception of 100 coin stars and red coin stars, but like I see Race Outside in the chat, it's kind of more just like point A to point B. Like to get most stars, you don't have to go and get X amount of things. You don't have to do it. You just you do some, yeah, like platforming or mini bosses, that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's more kind of linear in that sense, but at the same time, you also get the option, like, say if there's one stage where you don't want to get anything, you can still beat the game without glitches,
For sure.
right? You can.
And
So
skip whole levels for sure. Yeah, I
yeah,
would say the main difference is that most of the objectives are either platforming based or exploration based, as opposed to collecting based, and that shines through, in my opinion. So even though you're technically collecting the stars, I mean, you could say that in any game. I mean, if you got a star at the end of every level you beat in SMB1, it wouldn't be a collectathon. It's just like that just marks that you finished.
You're
whatever
collecting all
your
the
objective is.
flagpoles.
Yeah, I mean, you could get real technical or ridiculous with this, but I think in general, it doesn't feel to me when I do the 100 coin collections or the 8 red coin ones, those do feel like collectathons, but those are the only stars in the game that do, and they're completely optional. So
Yeah, I didn't have an answer to this when I wrote it down. I was just giving it some thought because, you know, I feel like that term gets used, and it's almost always in a negative sense. It's almost always used in a way to criticize a game. But I think the big difference between the two, and my nostalgia goggles are going to shine through right now, are that for Banjo-Kazooie, like, sure, Banjo-Kazooie had jiggies. Those were the big ones. And it also had notes and mumbo tokens and the Jinjos and all the feathers and everything. It had everything. It just everything everywhere.
And it restarts you when you die. I mean, don't even get me into. Come at me on Twitter at John Carls. Just tweet at me. I am not. Banjo's the most overrated game in the history of video games. Come at me.
So I think the thing is that it's exactly what you guys both ended up saying was it's all about the focus. I feel like for Super Mario 64, the game says you need to get stars. Like, stars are what matter, and everything else is sort of tangential to that. It's like you can get red coins if you want to get that star, or you get 100 coins if you want to get that star, but ultimately all that matters is stars. Whereas in Banjo-Kazooie, for instance, if you just focus on jiggies and forget about the notes, now you can't get through note stores. If you don't get enough mumbo tokens, then you can't transform into the things that you need to get the jiggies that you need to get the notes that you need in order to get through the note doors. If you don't pick up all the right items in just the right order, you're not going to get anywhere. And so it's all about the collection. Like, the game's focus is in collecting all of those things, which is great. I think it's its own style of gameplay because it promotes sort of exploration by saying if you don't traverse every single square inch of this map, then you're going to miss something. Whereas Super Mario 64 sort of, I feel like, took the opposite, and here's my nostalgia goggles for you. It took the opposite tack of making you want to explore naturally by just making the game fun already. So, I mean, I already want to see what everything has to offer. It didn't have to force me by telling me there was going to be something there.
that's a good point. Yeah.
I would like to say I don't hate Banjo-Kazooie, but I do think it's overrated.
I don't hate Banjo-Kazooie either.
I do think the 3D games had a lot of trouble after this, and again, there's definitely nostalgia goggles going on here. There's definitely no objectivity when it comes to me in this game because I love this game so much when it came out, and a lot of those games I didn't play back then, but it feels like a lot of them were not able to make the game itself as fun outside of achieving what you're trying to achieve, like we said, the movement, the platforming, like the exploration in general, and so maybe this is a collectathon, but I think it does it right, and so for that sake, I think it's really hard for other games to do it right. I think, you know, Odyssey did a great job with it. I think even like something like Breath of the Wild could have some of those elements. I think that did a great job with it. I think you can do it well, but yeah, since it comes with a negative connotation, I wouldn't like to assign that term to SM60.
All right. Well, thank you for that discussion. I'm going to jump right back in. So as far as just this game is concerned, it's kind of hard to talk about its popularity because most of the metrics that we use for popularity are about how many titles that it actually sold. But that's kind of difficult because this was a pack-in title, right? Like the Nintendo 64
I'm
packed
not
in this
sure. I
game.
think you still might have had to buy it separate. I don't think anything came with the N64. I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think it was pack-in.
Okay,
I don't
well,
think so. Yeah.
even if it wasn't a package, so it ended up
But it was
selling.
one of two games released when the system
Right.
came
Yeah,
out.
you had
So it's like
you had
if
very few
you're not gonna
choices.
buy the system and have no game, and so you're gonna buy that or Pilot Wing 64. Like you're gonna have to buy one of them, or else
Yeah.
why'd you buy the system?
Yeah, you're pretty limited. So 11 million copies of this game sold. And Nintendo eventually proved that this game could stand on its own, even without having to basically be the only game that it was this or nothing. So Nintendo eventually proved that the game could stand on its own by becoming the second most popular title on the Wii Virtual Console by June 2007, right behind Super Mario Brothers. So, Super Mario 64 released at a time when developers were still trying to figure out how to make the transition to 3D with their intellectual property. Crash Bandicoot, which was a new title at this time, had come out at the same time. So, the first Crash Bandicoot title was in 1996, even though I think it started development in 1994. But it avoided a lot of these issues, basically skirted around them by putting the camera on rails and lowering the degrees of freedom. So you don't have to solve the problem of a 3D camera if the camera only moves in one direction anyway.
Sure.
And the level design was built around that idea. I did an episode, Pocket, probably about 2 months ago on Bubsy, talking about Bubsy 3D a little bit. And I mentioned that this was one of the earliest 3D platformers in development, actually. This started earlier than almost any other 3D platformer title.
Yeah, they got mad that they thought SM64 stole their ideas, right?
Well, the thing about it was they had nothing to base it on. So Bubsy 3D solved a lot of the problems with a 3D camera by basically, again, just avoiding the idea of a 3D camera in general. The game is based; it just has tank controls, so the camera's always perched on Bubsy's shoulder. Like there's no need to worry about how the camera's going to work anyway. And the thing about Bubsy 3D is they were really proud of what they had. They thought that they were going to get a lot of sales with early 3D adopters. And then right before they were about to go to release, they saw Super Mario 64 at a trade conference and were like, oh no. this isn't good, and so they spent like 2 or 3 more months on development trying to shore up a few issues, and then we still got the Bubsy 3D
They should have
that
spent
we
2 to
got.
3 more decades trying to shore up the issues. It
Yeah.
didn't come out very well.
Yeah,
Do
it's
you think that's a better game than SM64, Chad?
do I think Bubsy 3D is a better
Yeah.
game? Oh, that's a tough call. Absolutely not, though. Super Mario 64 is definitely a better game. No, Bubsy 3D is a bad game. I enjoy playing it, but it's kind of a bad game. But in their defense, they had nothing to compare it to. You know, they were trying 3D for the first time, so I sort of give them like.
To be fair, all the people who made it lived in 3D their whole lives. I do want to point that out there. It's not
They
like
have-
it was their first experience with 3D.
They have seen 3 dimensions before, so.
Yeah. They had lived in 3 dimensions for a long time.
So a lot of games actually credit Super Mario 64 for inspiration, which should seem like a no-duh statement, but it just is so well regarded in the game development community as being the real turning point for 3D. Obvious games such as Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64 give a lot of credit to Super Mario 64 for basically solving the question of how to handle camera, how to handle a lot of these problems. But there's even less obvious ones like GoldenEye 007 and Kingdom Hearts. I remember reading that GoldenEye 007 credited Super Mario 64 for the idea of having lots of small objectives within each level rather than just one big objective per level. Like that idea of just breaking it down and making one area sort of have a lot of purpose.
Yeah.
That was credited to Super Mario 64. Ultimately, critics did praise Super Mario 64 for being the inspiration for pretty much all 3D platformers as we know them today, and they addressed a lot of problems that were plaguing 3D games at the time. So a lot of problems for fledgling 3D games were basically solved by Super Mario 64. Love it or hate it for how it ended up implementing these things, it did address a lot of these issues, such as teaching the player controls. So, you know, for pretty much everyone in the era, they were very comfortable with 2 dimensions. And so the transition between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions is just difficult. You know, I've heard stories of people who started off on 3D games, and it's like you hand them a controller and it's just intuitive. Like the moment they pick up the controller, it's just like, this is how you play a game. But if you hand them a controller for a 2D game, there's they can't make that connection. Whereas for a lot of us who started out on 2D games, that transition in the other direction was actually the hard one. And so Super Mario 64 addressed this in pretty simple ways, things like using the castle grounds as a consequence-free training area. Like you can drown in the water, but essentially there's no consequence for just playing around out there. There's no enemies, things like that. The castle courtyard, these locations where the game just sort of lets you run around without any real penalty once you're inside the castle itself, running around from painting to painting. Before you actually go into any of the paintings, you can just run around and explore how to move within that space and really get the handle on it. So you essentially get a minute and a half or 2 minutes minimum of free practice before you ever enter your first level, which is something that a lot of developers credit Super Mario 64 for that idea.
I'd say it's pretty amazing that, you know, SMB1 basically invented the 2D platformer. I mean, if you're a video game historian, then you know there's other games like Pac-Land and stuff that did it first, but it really established that genre. And same with this, establishing the 3D genre, like same company, you know, same property. It's pretty awesome. I'd also say, like, anecdotally speaking, I felt like this is around the time where a lot of casual gamers dropped out of video games, the move from 2D to 3D. I remember like the people like my parents and my parents' friends and stuff played original Nintendo and stuff and enjoyed it quite a bit. But you know, the Super Nintendo having a lot more buttons, and then once it moved to 3D, they were like, I'm out, not interested anymore. So it was kind of an interesting transition time for gamers in terms of like the older generation that grew up on, you know, played Atari 2600, NES, and systems like that, just didn't want, you know, all these different buttons and options. I also think it's cool, the camera for this game, you know, I mean, love or hate the N64 controller, which is just one of the most bizarre controller designs in the world.
Yeah, that controller is something else.
Just like if you see 3D gaming and like the first thing you see is this controller, I feel like
it looks like you could stab someone with it for sure.
Yeah, like,
and
I don't know,
it looks more like a trident than a controller.
I've heard stories that the controller was sort of developed with Super Mario 64 in mind, which makes me only more confused about the controller. Like, how do you say, you know, we need a controller and we're going to base it on our principal IP. So we just need to make this controller the best controller it can be for a Mario game. And they came up with this. It's just, it's fantastic.
But it's awesome that you have the buttons to change the camera. I know that they don't always work properly and it can be frustrating, but like to have that as a resolution for the 3D problem is pretty creative and pretty awesome. I mean, you mentioned like Crash Bandicoot, which is a game I also grew up with and loved a lot, but like that's not an exploration game. Like you said, it's on rails and it doesn't really even come off as a 3D game almost, you know. I mean, it is, but it's not in the same you know, vein as SM64.
That exact same game could have existed on the Super Nintendo using like isometric design like Super Mario
using
RPG.
Mode 7, using, you know, I mean, Mario Kart on SNES basically did the same thing where it's scaling as you move forward, backwards, whatever.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it was cool that you could control the camera and it helps or hurts you depending on how good, like, you have to become skilled at using the camera just like you do using the controls, because if you suck at using the camera, you get, you know, the camera stuck right up on Mario's face. I think it's also cool that in the beginning they show Lakitu and that's what your camera is. Like, I don't know, I think that's a really creative, interesting way to be.
Yeah,
like,
it's
oh,
like,
this is, why is this 3D? Oh, because it's being filmed by Lakitu, who previously threw things at you for about 3 or 4 different games.
You're like, he's following me, no thank you.
Yeah, now he's your friend who films things for some reason, so I don't get that. But I thought that was like a cool, cute explanation. Like all those little touches that SM64 did, just I think make it shine.
I saw a photo on Wikipedia. I didn't realize this, but they were talking about the camera a little bit on Wikipedia, and there's a photo there where it shows the way the camera pans as you're coming up on the mountain in Bomb Battlefield, right as the slope is coming up, and it shows the way the camera sort of winds around a little bit to show you that slope before you actually arrive to it. And it's really interesting the care that they took to make sure that the camera wasn't just sitting over your shoulder or sort of following in your footsteps, but they actually seemed like they were taking some care to make sure that the camera was showing not just where you were headed, but where you could head and things that you might want to watch out for. Like, there seems like there was just a little bit of care taken to make sure that, you know, if you're going to do 3D cameras for the first time, that you make sure it's a gentle transition.
Yeah, I will say that there's a lot of people who hate this game nowadays, which kind of shocked me. I didn't realize. I mean, we were talking before the podcast, but we ended up in this conversation like 6 months ago or a year ago, where we had some friends of ours trying to argue that this wasn't even a top like 25 Nintendo 64 game, which like blew my mind. But I can imagine if you never played this as a kid and you hop in on it, like the camera is super confusing. Like I have built in the back of my brain through growing up on this game how to control the camera while I control the player, but that's not something a modern gamer will have ingrained in them. Like we're used to, intuitive cameras. Although I'll say even nowadays, like stuff like Breath of the Wild, there's times where the camera gets stuck in some weird place where I'm frustrated and can't do things. Like this has always been an issue with 3D games, but it's something that I think if you hopped in on this game not having played it as a kid, it would be super frustrating because you're used to it being handled a lot better.
Yeah, the camera's
You know,
hard, and I mean this is just so early in 3D games life cycle. It's hard. Like we we go to so much effort on this podcast to avoid rating and talking about things in terms of, well, what about in that era? You know, just talking about things of, well, you have to understand the era that it came from.
the context.
Yeah, we try to talk about things from both that context and a modern context. And I'll say that this game, like in a modern context, does not hold up to a lot of games. But 3D cameras are hard, and this was the first real attempt at a proper dynamic 3D camera. And I think, honestly, it's a fantastic attempt for being one of the first ones.
Definitely. So one interesting thing, much like the Famicom disk system, there was a peripheral that was made for the N64. It was called, that most people probably aren't familiar with. It's called, what was it called? The 64DD, or the disk drive, dynamic drive.
Yeah,
It was released in Japan in December of 1999, and there was a American release planned for 2000, but was ultimately canceled with only 10 of its approximately 60 games planned ever being released. 4 of which were Mario Art titles using the mouse and a modem, and there were microphone peripherals for it as well. One really interesting thing, a really popular YouTuber named Metal Jesus Rocks recently came across, he's a collector, a North American Nintendo 64 disk drive, dynamic drive, whatever you want to call it. And it's the first one in known existence for a North American one. It was a prototype. He lives in Seattle, so he's right near wherever Nintendo North America was developing a lot of stuff or whatever. And he ended up with one, and it works. He has a bunch of videos you can go check out that really dive into the history of this. He had like experts fly out to him and check it out. Like it was a pretty big deal in the collecting community that this was found because up to this point it was only ever released in Japan, and there's no evidence of the North American physical prototypes or anything. It was pretty cool.
yeah, but there was a sequel for Super Mario 64 that was released or planned to be released for the 64DD in 1999, but it was canceled early in development with only one level having ever been created. And Nintendo had hinted at an E3 event that some of the elements developed for this game might have actually made its way into Sunshine or Galaxy games. So it's not necessarily that we lost out on all of that, but it probably just rolled its way into some future games as well.
I think Nintendo does that pretty often, where if they come up with something early and don't use it, they find a way of utilizing. I think we've talked about that on the podcast in a couple of different situations, which is cool. I feel like they have a bird's eye perspective of what they're doing at all times generally. But we're praising Nintendo because we love them so much. We're little fanboys, so what are you gonna do? Also, there was a remake for the Nintendo DS called Super Mario 64 DS, which gave a new generation, the young whippersnappers of the world that, much younger than me and Chad, might have just grown up on this game. They got to enjoy Super Mario 64, but this game added being able to use Luigi, Yoshi, and Wario as playable characters. There's altered courses, there's touchscreen mini games, there's 30 additional stars, and there's also a multiplayer mode. I think that's also been showcased at GDQs in the past and stuff. It has its own speedrunning community with its own glitches and tricks and whatnot. But it's funny because Chad's been a big part of the SMW community for a long time, and a lot of those people are younger, grew up on the Game Boy Advance port of SMW, and it's probably just as true that a lot of people grew up on this DS remake rather than having played it on the 64, which makes me feel old and sad, but it's pretty cool.
It is kind of nice to see these sort of reboots and remakes. Nintendo trying to make some of their old IPs accessible to new players, things like Ocarina of Time 3DS and Majora's Mask 3DS and those sorts of things. I think that they do a pretty good job of picking and choosing the games that have been successful for them in the past, and rather than just porting it, which would be so easy to do, they usually do like a proper revamp that gives even seasoned fans of the game a reason to buy them. The Super Mario Advance 2, which is Super Mario World for the Game Boy Advance, that has slightly redesigned levels. There's dragon coins in every single level now, so it's practically a completely different game at that point, just with the small changes that they had to make.
Definitely.
This game has,
I think, one big thing too, just with the DS version, just the addition of the 3 extra characters, I think was really cool. Also, because I know, like, obviously with the regular version, there's been countless theories about getting to play as Luigi. Some say if you go in the courtyard in the back and you run around 362 times and then go on every tree without touching the ground, you'll play as Luigi and all that.
Don't you miss that era of gaming when like you just hear something and you're like, okay, I've got to figure out how to do it, and like there's no internet to check, there's nothing.
I still remember when the theory that they're like in the volcano in Lethal Lava Land, like if you jumped into the lava at like a very specific spot at just the right angle or something like that, there was like a hidden room with Luigi in it. And I don't know if I was just the dumbest kid in the world or if that was just the right era for that kind of thing, but I was like, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, that makes sense.
For like a decade, like Final Fantasy VII always had rumors of like, oh, Aerith doesn't have to die. You can this, and this. People leveling her up to level 99. They're doing all kinds of different stuff just trying to get her to live. And like, you didn't have the internet to be like, no, that's not a thing. Sorry. It's just not. So you have these rumors, and I don't know. There's a fun time. It was a fun time in life. That's all I gotta say. But yeah, it's gonna be weird in 10, 15 years when people are like, oh yeah, I grew up playing Ocarina of Time on the 3DS, and I played Donkey Kong Country on the SNES Mini, and it's weird.
Twilight Princess on the Wii U.
Yeah, we're getting old. We're getting old, Chad.
Yeah,
we're getting old.
It hurts. There's also a pretty good. We talked a little bit about this with Super Mario World about the fantastic ROM hacking community. There's a pretty pronounced ROM hacking community for this game as well. It's a lot of ROM hacks. Unfortunately, a lot of them, to my knowledge, are in the state that Super Mario World ROM hacking was in about 10 years ago, where a lot of them depend pretty heavily on emulator-specific glitches, and so you can't really play them on flash cards, or if you were to burn them to EEPROM or whatever.
Yeah, the N64 unfortunately just can't handle basically the amount of things that most people put into their ROM hacks. There's very few exceptions, but most ROM hacks, they'll either crash or they'll play it like quite literally 1 to 2 frames per second.
Yeah,
a lot easier to pull off tricks that way, though.
That is right. Yes.
Yeah, you can backwards long jump your way to heaven.
A frame perfect trip gives you 1 to 2 seconds.
Yeah, the Super Mario World ROM hacking community, about 10 years ago, it was basically the only way you could play them was with ZSNES, like just the world's most broken emulator. And it's only been within the past like 3 or 4 years that the whole Super Mario ROM hacking community has come around and been like, they all need to play on actual console. Like if they can play on actual console, then they're good enough. I'm eager for the day where that happens with the Super Mario 64 ROM hacking community, because I've got my EverDrive ready, and maybe one day we'll see ROM hacks being made that can be properly played on. I know that there's a handful that can, but there's not much out there.
Yeah, and there's some where it's like, maybe one level will load properly and then the rest of the game won't. But yeah, that would be great to see that happen, because there's a lot of ROM hacks that are extremely well built, just unfortunately only play on emulator.
For sure.
It's awesome. So let's go ahead and take a quick break, and then we're going to do our standard review of this game where we break it down by category and we kind of discuss it and give it an overall rating from 0 to 10. Okay, so each episode, what we do is a rating section where we break down video and kind of just discuss them from a casual perspective. So we're going to talk about the graphics, the music and sound, the controls and gameplay, difficulty and fairness, fun and replayability. We'll make any miscellaneous comments that we have, and then we're going to give an overall rating from 0 to 10. Just keep in mind these are not IGN ratings, so everything is not 7 to 10. We've given a game a 0.5 before. We've given games 10, so we use the whole spectrum. So like an average game would come out as a 5. So just keep that in mind. So talking about that, graphics. This is a tough discussion in
Yeah.
2017.
There's really two ways to look at it.
Absolutely.
Obviously, for its time, it was absolutely groundbreaking. But nowadays, I think if you had a 10-year-old play this, he'd say it looks like crap.
Yeah.
Yep.
This is like a 1996 10 and a 2017 6.
It's tough because I think 8 and 16-bit graphics. We've talked about this ad nauseum, but they've aged really well, and that aesthetic is
so much
really
better.
Great. Sprite work is really awesome, and that's a lot of these modern type of games that are made in the retro style, like Shovel Knight and the Shantae games, Azure Striker Gunvolt, stuff like that. They're more in like an enhanced 16-bit style, I'd say. I mean, I don't think you could boot one of those on a 16-bit system, but like they follow the same kind of sprite work and stuff. Early 3D graphics don't age very well. It's it's rough.
It's an
Even up
unfortunate
through
truth.
PS2. Yeah, like until we hit PS2 really is when things started looking like they should. Even early PlayStation 1, all of N64.
And sadly,
I love these graphics. They blew my mind when they came out, and I still like them quite a bit. But I mean, I can understand why somebody might criticize them. I like them though. They're colorful. All the different worlds look very different. They have unique feels to them. There's just a huge variety of level design between snow levels and water level, this, that, and the other. Mario looks cool in 3D. I mean, it was an awesome thing to see him in 3D. But obviously, everything is very not pixelated, polygonal, and there's a lot of sharp edges, and
there's even I know because of the N64's limited power, if there gets to be like enough things on the screen and Mario's like a certain distance from the camera, they actually have another model that's a low poly model of Mario.
Oh wow.
And if you thought he looked bad otherwise, like yeah,
I've seen that model. It's horrific.
Yeah,
it sure is something. I mean, this game, it's unfortunate. And I think one of the biggest problems isn't actually the low poly count for the models, but it's also the texture scaling. Like you're standing on the ground, it's so close to the camera, and you just look at it and you're like, I can count the pixels.
It's frustrating to judge something like this because like similar discussion in FF7 we had, like those were literally the best graphics that existed at the time. Like those cutscenes were mind blowing, and you look back at them now and you're just like they didn't even stay consistent between the cutscenes. They didn't know, like you're really just running around on like a painting. Like it's just like, but at the time it was unbelievable. I mean, you're coming from like playing Donkey Kong 64 or Donkey Kong Country and stuff like that, which were cool games, but I mean, like just moving to 3D was just mind blowing. But yeah, it's a tough one to age now. Music and sound, on the other hand, I think the music is aged fine. I love the music, specifically the water music is just the best. You just want to fall asleep to it. You just want to curl up in a little ball and take a little nappy.
Aquarium music is pretty comfy.
Yeah,
that's probably the one Levels music where I consistently have people come in my chat and just be like, I love this music. This is like the reason I still play the game sometimes.
Sound effects are good.
Yeah,
I love the music design.
This was actually the first. Okay, so this game was composed by Koji Kondo, right? That I'm pretty sure that's correct.
Sounds right.
And this was the first game that featured Charles Martinet as the voice of Mario, who has now been the voice of Mario for every game since.
Can we talk about how fun it was the first screen though? We didn't mention this where you Mario's face out and stuff.
Oh yeah.
Like even stuff like that, you were just like, this is so cool.
Yeah, it seems they just wanted you to get just wanted you to get excited, but like I don't know, it's hard to talk about a video game and be like, they just wanted to make it clear that you're here to have fun, but I mean that's what they were doing. It was just sort of reducing the game down to its minimal parts.
What are some other good hot tracks from this game?
Well, the cool thing too is actually there's a lot of levels where It's actually the same song, but it's just composed slightly differently. Like some
Mhm.
examples are Bob on Battlefield and Cool Cool Mountain.
Okay.
If you listen to those songs, they sound quite different, but they're actually the same song.
Right.
Yeah, I love when Nintendo does that. They do that quite a bit with a lot of different things. I like when you're going on the slide. That song
Yeah,
is
yeah,
really
that's another
upbeat and
classic.
excited. All the different slides you do. That's some of the most fun gameplay too.
They made a
I think
really
those
good.
are the little elements they add. Like, oh, like the swimming. I mean, obviously swimming levels are always questionable, but like the swimming was different. Like the slide, going down the slide was fun. Like all the different gameplay was really engaging.
I think
And the music always fits that feeling to make you excited about it.
they made a really good choice with the first track you hear, or the first course track you hear being "Bomb on
Mhm.
Battlefield." Like it's just such a really great iconic song. I think Nintendo's actually always done a really great job of this. Not necessarily that they just took whatever their best song was and put it first, but rather it seems like there's a lot of effort put into making whatever song you hear first in the game a really iconic and memorable one.
Definitely.
I think that they did a great job with that with the song that you hear in Bomb on Battlefield, which is necessarily pretty much the first song you hear in the game if you don't count the castle.
Yeah, and they do a good job of setting the tone for the environment. Like, about like the haunted house level is like
Hmm.
pretty spooky and does a
Yeah.
good job of setting an eerie tone.
Hazy Maze
Like all of
Cave.
the Bowser stages are like high suspense anxiety in terms of like you realize that the stakes are up to like, oh, this is going to be intense. And then having the voice samples is cool too. I mean, like this is early on and getting some quality voice samples into a game. And so getting to hear Mario's voice for the first time was pretty cool.
Actually, one thing kind of on that note, there's some beta footage from SM64 that's been released, and the voice acting that they had before then was absolutely horrific.
Was it
If
like
you
the
ever
Mario Super Show or something?
like, I think a specific one
Hey,
is when he triple
paisanos.
jumps. He does like some insane like if you think his voice was high pitched, then it was
Yeah,
just
why
this.
is it so high pitched? I think that was the big surprise. I don't think I ever
Yeah,
imagined Mario's voice being like, "Hey, na-ba-da-na-na."
and then they
Really
actually
surprised.
had a mechanic that they took out, called it was a spin jump. So basically, when like if you jumped onto like a fly guy or something and he'd spin around,
Mm.
that used to be just like a type of jump you could do,
Oh
and he
wow,
made some insanely stupid noise. I don't even know how to describe it properly. It was just so bad.
high pitched
Um,
squeal or something.
yeah, you can go on YouTube. I think if you search like Beta 64, I
Hmm.
think there was a channel called, and they basically review like the betas of some older games. And if you find the one for that, there's actually a lot of fun little tidbits in there that it's cool to see how they kind of polished it after the beta.
Definitely. So moving on from that, controls and gameplay. Start this off, I guess. I think the game controls. Um, there's such a variety of different jumps and moves, and that was super unique to the Mario franchise. I think the gameplay. We touched a lot of this when we talked about the collectathon part, but I do think it's engaging. I think it, encourages you to explore. It encourages you to try different things. It does a good job of teaching you the different jumps and moves without having to take you through a tutorial or take you through a training thing. I think a lot of the different aspects of it were fun. I think like the slide sections, like I said just a minute ago, are really fun. I think the boss fights and stuff are all pretty not great. Like they're not very unique or exciting. I mean, they're pretty lame. And I think that's something Mario really struggled with for a long time. I mean, I can't outside of SMB 2, I can't think of any boss fights that are interesting. SMB 1, you just ran past Bowser. SMB 3, you jumped on the same stupid thing's head 3 times. SMW's bosses are completely trivial outside of maybe the final Bowser. So that was always something that was secondary, which is funny because you go back and play NES and SNES games, and a lot of those, the big focus is the boss fights and the combat on those. Mario was always focused on the level design and the platforming. But I think they did a great job. I think it's challenging and fun to do the different platforming, and there's plenty of parts that took a lot of practice and trying to get good at. There's plenty of parts that are easy. I think it's yeah, I always thought it was a lot of fun. I think that's the whole point of the game, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. The big thing is they gave Mario like very few, I guess, ways to attack the bosses.
Mhm.
So it just made it very hard, I guess, to sort of creatively implement them.
Yeah,
Um,
combat is really light in this game in
yeah, that's
general.
exactly it.
But that's kind of true of almost every Mario game
Hmm.
up to this point.
Yeah, that hasn't really changed.
It's
Um,
gotten better since then. I think like definitely fights in Sunshine. There's definitely fights in Odyssey that are really interesting.
Yeah, they definitely stepped
But
it up for Odyssey.
yeah, I mean Odyssey has a lot of more unique fighting for sure, and you can possess different characters and stuff. And but the
Galaxy's
Mario
bosses
games
are
always
pretty good.
focused on the level design and platforming, and that's cool. But definitely light on the combat.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes this game really shine is that there's a ton of different ways to move your character. There's a ton of different ways to move
Definitely.
Mario, but the game doesn't feel the need to overdo it with teaching you how to play. Like, you sort of figure out naturally that you can double jump and that your second jump's higher, and that's naturally going to lead you to trying a triple jump and seeing that that's a special type of jump. And then by the time you get to Cool Mountain, if you haven't figured it out already, there's literally a star that tells you wall kicks will work. So then you kind of learn that you can jump off of walls. And once you've learned that you can jump off of walls, then you sort of get into the business of figuring out, okay, now I can crouch, and now I can do backflips, or you're going to naturally run across an instance where you're moving too fast one direction, you try to turn around and you jump, and then you do like a side flip or something like that. And like the natural organic discovery of all of these little pieces
Yep.
of movement are eventually going to become pieces in your arsenal.
That's definitely something the Mario games have always been really good at. I feel like is teaching you the gameplay, teaching you the movement, teaching you the move sets without having to, like we said, do a tutorial or do anything. Like you said, there's a section where you have to kick off of various walls. It's clear that that's the objective. Mario Odyssey does that, where it's like, oh well, clearly I have to possess this or do this, and you start learning the different move sets to get to certain places. I think Mario's always been good at that, and it's something that I think a lot of games struggle with. I think it's part of what makes Mario so fun, is just how it organically unrolls for you in that way.
Yeah, and part of that too, I think, almost allowed like they have a way they want you to get stars, but I
Hmm.
think they're like using different movement options. You can definitely find ways that were, I mean, quite easily, like not necessarily utilizing glitches. You can just find little different ways to do it,
Definitely.
um,
There's
just utilizing different movement options.
it gives you incentive to experiment, I would say, in
Mhm.
terms of like, oh well, can I use the flying cap and get to this point here faster than I would if I wasn't, or can I jump down the entire ice level and land near the penguin instead of having to go traverse my way down all these slides. Like, it encourages you to try different things. And lives are pretty plentiful. I think that's why Odyssey decided to completely scrap lives, because it's fun to experiment and not have some sort of punishment of I've got to go grind and get more lives. But Mario 64 let you save at any point, and you never had issue getting lives. Usually as a kid you'd like grind and get like 100 lives and just go goof around or something. Like, that's what I do, at least. Like, I knew where I could get like 7 lives really quickly, and then I would just experiment and fool around and do stuff. And I think that's the most fun gaming I ever have, is just being able to play around and have fun with that. So
Yeah, this would have been the first game that really sort of instituted that overall change in the Mario universe, where with Super Mario World and Super Mario Brothers 3, the cost of failure is sometimes
mm-hmm.
losing your progress. You go back to whatever your last checkpoint is, and you may have to replay levels. But this game really knocked out the penalty for dying. I mean, you naturally are going to save after every single star, and so what does dying really cost you, aside
Yeah.
from you now have to walk slightly further through the castle rather than jump straight back into the painting?
Unless you're 97 coins into getting all 100, die and you have to start over again. That's the punishment, is getting those. But yeah, I mean, I think they took care of a lot of that with something like Odyssey. That there are stars that take a lot longer to get to in Mario 64, and it is a pain that you get booted out each time. Like, I'm thinking specifically the magic carpet ride at the end. Like, it's several minutes long, so if you die at any point during that, like, you're going back a long way. But for the most part, it's not like you're at 80 stars and now you're back at 50 and you have to do all this stuff again. Like, the game's pretty forgiving in that. And I think that's pretty natural transition into our difficulty and fairness conversation. I mean, I think this game is pretty fair, and maybe a little bit on the easy side, but finding all 120 stars was definitely a challenge as a kid. And especially not having the internet, not having people tell you how to do things. um but I always felt like it was fair. I mean, I got all 120 stars and I wasn't very good at video games then, so it can't be that hard, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing they did a great job with is like having a fair or like a good increase in difficulty as you get farther in the game. Like
Hmm.
it wasn't like too steep where like you're cruising and then all of a sudden it's just something you can't do. Like it gradually increased, and at the end, mistakes would be more costly, usually result in a death rather than maybe just like falling down or something like that.
Definitely.
Yeah, TikTok clock and Rainbow Ride being saved for the last two worlds is a very clear indicator that they were holding their cards until the very end. Because
Yeah, once you get upstairs in general, I mean, the game gets a lot more difficult. Like even the middle floor, well, I don't know what you'd want to call it, but once you go upstairs, there's that water level that has a lot of those like water skipping things. I don't know what that level's called.
What dry world?
Yeah, wet dry world. That has a lot of pretty difficult stars to get to. The big world, small world thing.
Tiny
Like
Huge
that one
Island.
always. Yeah, that one frustrates me because there's a lot of stars that are hard to figure out. It's easy to die trying to get those stars. So it definitely does ramp up in difficulty, but it does do it gradually. And by the time you get to those parts, you've mastered the movement, you've mastered the jumps, and you know how to look for different stars and such.
Yeah, actually, one thing to talk about too there almost is kind of like the dynamics of there's Wet Dry World, and then there's actually Tiny Huge Island after, where
Yeah.
like with Wet Dry World, for example, if you enter the bottom of the painting, the water level's low, and if you enter the top of the painting, it's like really high. Um,
Oh, I
as a
never knew
child,
that.
I never figured that one out. Yeah, so there was actually a few stars I couldn't get because I had absolutely no idea to head to the downtown portion of Wet Dry
Yeah, I
World.
as a kid I knew about that, but I don't know whether or not I knew it because of like a Nintendo Power or someone told me, or if I discovered it
Can't you
myself.
still get them by like hitting those things to raise and lower the water
Yeah,
at a certain?
you can also use the cannon to shoot into the
Well, that's what I did. Yeah,
funnel
100%.
for
Yeah,
the
I
town.
unfortunately, I guess I couldn't aim that well as a kid, or I didn't have the patience, but I never ended up going downtown.
Oh, I went. Yeah, I shot that cannon all the way. I probably did a couple Kobe shots before I fully got in there, but yeah. I mean, I honestly, I'll say this. I honestly don't like the once you get past the downstairs, like the basement and the middle, the first floor. Like I love going back and playing this game, and I know those other worlds so well, and then I get to the harder ones and I suck at them so much. I'm just like, I get frustrated, but it's a lot of fun. I think it's a fair game, and I think it has enough difficulty that it's not a baby game. But
Yeah, I
Yeah,
considered this pretty easy as a kid, but I think that's because I had the perspective of playing it for like 6 months to finally beat it.
exactly, you're playing it
And
all the time.
and so now that I've gotten older, I was like, man, this game was really easy. And so when I go and I try to do a 120 star fun run, I realize it's actually
Yeah,
not that easy. Like there's a lot of pretty big roadblocks for you. Um,
especially if you're trying to go fast. That's
yeah.
yeah, that's a big thing too.
I'm not
Um,
good at going fast. I'll
I
be
feel like
honest.
TikTok clock is
Confession.
difficult at any speed. I
Yeah,
mean,
TikTok clock.
I'm not
That's
sure. I'm not sure if everyone out there is going to disagree with that point, but TikTok clock is just so
that level
frustrating.
is a bunch of tomfoolery. I'll tell you what.
you could almost talk about it too, how like in terms of difficulty, where we talked about how mistakes just aren't penalized as much. Where you die, you just fall out of the stage and you save. Um,
Right.
I think that could be tight, like almost make it seem less difficult because like
Hmm.
maybe you like if you try and do it in one sitting, maybe you die a bunch of times. It sets you back
Sure.
like a minute each time. Where another game that you might consider difficult, it might be just as easy to die or easier, but it's just that when you do, it sets you back way more. And
Yeah. Like SMW, you're gonna have to replay 3 or 4 levels.
Mhm.
A lot of the Mario games, you at least have to start at the beginning of the world or whatever when you game over. Um, and this kind of transitions into fun and replayability. I think this game has a lot of replay factor because of the fact that you can get, technically you can get less than 70 stars, obviously, but if you're just playing this as a normal human being, not BlueBob, not some legend, you can get 70 stars, you can try and get 120 stars, you can get those different ways where you can entirely skip certain levels, or you can try and get some in every level. This game has a ton of replayability, and it's just fun. It's one of those games that I think the N64 era has a lot of nostalgia because it's um there's a lot of party games on it. There's a lot of games you can play with other people. GoldenEye, there's the Mario Party games. Mario Kart was so big. And this is also one of those games that's fun to just go back to. And like you said, casual 120 star quote unquote run. Like I've tried those many times where it's just like, I'm not really doing any strats. I'm not really doing anything. I have a timer going and I'm just going to go try and find all the stars. Like that's just a really fun thing to do. And like, even if you know where they are, the way the movement works, the way the levels are, the nostalgia, it's just super replayable.
For sure. Yeah, I really like this game because I feel like it, for all the hate that we sort of we didn't hate, but for all the discussion about collectathon, whether or not that's a disparaging term or not, I think that games like this that sort of give you the option to collect everything or collect nothing or collect some of the things, you make your own road through it. It really does promote replayability, and it promotes a really organic sense of fun, because for a game like Super Mario World, once you get from one end of the level to the other, there's really no reason to revisit it. I mean, you can play the game different ways if you want to, but that's up to you. Yeah, but there's really no reason to replay a level. But I remember as a kid really fondly going into levels in Super Mario 64 and just wandering around completely aimlessly, no target in mind. I wasn't hunting down stars. I probably already had them all at that point. But I would go into a level and I would just wander around trying to, play around. I felt like the physics were fun. I felt like it was enjoyable to just goof around, get thrown around by the flippers. I don't know what those guys are called. Like in Wet Dry World, the little robots that go around and flip you. I found things like that really fun. You try and go and
get as many coins as you could. Like I said, like Nintendo Power literally had a thing where it'd be like, who's got the most coins in this level? Take a screenshot. It's like, you don't need more than 100. You get no benefit getting all 127 coins that are available or whatever. But, that's how much people would just want to play around in the game. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I think games like this and I think that this is a real testament to that anecdote that I mentioned with Miyamoto saying, if the game is just fun to play, then the rest of the game is going to fall naturally out of that. I think that that's a real testament to that design philosophy, and that if you just make the game fun, you don't have to provide 30 objectives for the player. If you just make it
surf
fun.
on a Koopa shell. You just surf around.
Well, yeah, awesome. Why not?
That was a lot of fun. So miscellaneous thoughts outside of the fact that this is, one of the first 3D platformers. It did a great job. It's Mario.
I'm just going to say my miscellaneous thought is that pretty much everything I've said and everything I'm going to say from here on out, in addition, is through some pretty heavy nostalgia goggles. Like, while I can ultimately 100%. Identify that this game is not has not held up all that great. I mean, there's no way that you can objectively say that a game like Super Mario 64 is better than Odyssey. Like, subjectively, you may enjoy it more, but I think that it's in an objective sense, the games that came after this are probably going to fare better. But I just, this was a game that I grew up on, and it was really one of the first games I ever played where, they took off the timer, they took off the training wheels, they just said, go have fun, and I did. And that really clicked with me personally. And so I have a lot of fondness for this game that's tied to my experiences with it at age, 8, whatever I would.
That's a good point to add. Also, is removing the timer, because every Mario game up to this point basically wanted you to beat the level in a certain amount of time. Like, you run out of time, you die. This game just let you goof around in a level for as long as you wanted. So it took away that pressure of like, well, I can't just play around here. I've got to get to the end because it's ticking down. I think that made it a lot more fun as well. So overall rating, this is gonna be really hard. I'm not sure what mine is yet. I don't want to go first, but if you want me to, I can go first.
No, I'll go first. I'm gonna go ahead and take the bullet for the team. I'm going for a 9. I want to go for a 10. It has too many flaws that actually exist due to the fact that this was the entrance into 3D, but I have too much fondness for this game to rate it, our normal milquetoast 7 or something like that. Like, this is a fantastic game. It really, really does stand up in terms of showing what Nintendo was capable with what they had at the time. But it's not a perfect game. It's not a 10. It just isn't.
Yeah, unfortunately, with me, I think my rating for the game almost varies depending how well my speed.
It's hard when you speed run it.
Yeah, there's some days I just want to give it a -6, and there's other days,
of course,
by PB it's a 12. But I think if I look at it objectively, just the fun I had as a kid, it's the fact it's one of the few games I actually you know, especially when I found out about emulators, you know, just I replayed it over, like, probably at least once a year. I'd just come back and, you know, get 120 stars and over the course of a day or two. Um, I'd definitely say, like, yeah, between probably 8 and 9. Um, you know, there were definitely some issues, as Author Blue stated, as in regards to it just being one of the first 3D games. Obviously, there's a lot of things that they've since ironed out, but back then, you know, over the course of, you know, the small amount of time.
Yeah. Well,
This-
here's the problem with rating something like this. I mean, it depends on how many like tens you exist in the world. Like, you know, like for me, I'm gonna go ahead and be the one. I'm gonna give it a 10, and the reason I'm gonna give it a 10 is because it is the best game on the system it came out for. It is the best Nintendo 64 game, and it's my second favorite Mario game behind the newly released Mario Odyssey, which I think is freaking unbelievable. But I don't see how, you know, I mean, if we're gonna say like, oh, there's only like 2010s in the world, then no, it has flaws and stuff. But if you're the best game on your system, you deserve a 10. So I give it a 10. I think I
that's
don't
a
think
fair
there's a
argument.
game that's anywhere close to it on the N64. That's
I don't know.
as
Have you
good.
played? Have you played Blast Core?
I do own Blast Core. I haven't played it yet though.
It's
I'll
real
just say
good though.
if I own an N64 and you say you're on a desert island and you say you can only own one game, you're gonna pick Mario 64 more likely than not. And if you're the best game on the system, I don't see how you can't get a 10 out of 10. I think you're being too strict on a grading scale, if not. But
that is a good
I mean,
point,
if you're
actually.
grading it in terms of in comparison to every game ever invented, which is not normally what I do, obviously it has flaws compared to games with 20 years of game design behind them that didn't exist then, and advances in technology and all this. But I don't know. I gotta say 10.
Yeah, I would say that in terms of the greater context, like this is a modern day 7, but
Yeah, exactly. I
it's
would
for its
completely
time.
agree with that.
It's for its time. For me, it's still a 9. I still think it has too many like internal flaws that
Sure.
could have been addressed. But I 100% agree with you. It's hard to say you're the best game on your console and you don't get a 10.
Yeah, it's hard because, for example, I'm doing Game Boy Quest where I'm trying to beat every game, and I'm trying to judge those games completely in context of just the Game Boy. And boy, does it give way different ratings than when I look back and think about them in comparison to other video games. You know, like recently I gave the Smurfs like a 7 because it was like a really good platformer. But it's like, I mean, compared to like Mario Odyssey, how do you compare like a Game Boy game from, you know, 25 years ago to that? It's so I'm gonna stick with the 10. I feel fine with it. I love this game. It's so much fun. It's one of my top 10 probably favorite games of all time. And so,
I'm with you.
there you go.
So my
I
disconnect
agree
for
with your
this-
rating, and I gave it a different number.
Well, let's go ahead and take a quick hot break, and then we are going to hear from the legend BlueBob about how to beat this game fast.
So we're very fortunate today, talking about the speed run. So this is one episode, as I mentioned earlier, that you know, we've been doing this podcast for a while, and there's some games that we have kind of avoided because they're low hanging fruit. You know, it
We
wasn't
need
until
BlueBob for this one, is what we're getting at.
yeah, no kidding. So we waited till like episode 40 to do Super Mario Brothers 2 because it's like if you do a retro gaming podcast, Super Mario Brothers 2 is the lowest of low hanging fruit. And likewise, this is a speedrunning podcast as well. So games like Ocarina of Time and Super Mario 64, they're like pillars of the community, and you kind of want to make sure you get them right. So we put this episode off for a long time. We can't do it anymore. We're professionals. This is how it works. So now we're talking about Super Mario 64. So if you're new to Super Mario 64 speedruns, I'm about to talk a little bit about the history of sort of how any percent developed, more or less. A lot of the terminology might be new to you, but over the course of this discussion, we'll definitely talk about all of it. So don't be too surprised by that. So
Also, I'd just like to say, if you're new to speedrunning in general, you can go ahead and check out our episode 0. It is very old. Maybe we should do a reboot of it because we sucked at this then, and now we're mediocre at it. But we do go over a lot of the terminology of speedrunning and such. So if you're listening to this and you're mostly a casual gamer and you don't know much about speedrunning, some of the terms we use, we go over a lot of those there.
Definitely. So the categories for this game are generally named after the number of stars they're needed to complete the run. So the earliest speedruns of this game completed the game as intended with 70 stars, which is the intended minimum number of stars that you need to access the final Bowser level due to the endless staircase that separate the top floor of the castle from the actual entrance to Bowser's final level. But at one point, the discovery of skipping the endless staircase using a trick that's known as backwards long jumping was discovered, and that cut the theoretical minimum number of stars down to 50, which is the number that's required to open the star door that leads to the top floor of the castle. So basically, the history of any percent, the history of the shortest possible category, has evolved by means of finding a glitch to skip the one barrier each step along the way. And so soon it was discovered that you could even skip the 50-star door. You could break through the door using the same backwards long jumping, just up a different staircase. And by building up enough speed to clip through it, now all that was needed was 31 stars. So you needed 30 to access Dire Dire Docks, 1 star in Dire Dire Docks to gain access to Bowser in the Fire Sea, which would give you access to the second key, which would lead to the upstairs, which would then lead you to the 50-star door. In 2004, it was discovered that by using Mips, the rabbit, you could actually clip through the 30-star door, and he spawns in the basement after collecting 15 stars. So that meant that now that you could use Mips after collecting 15 stars, you would still need to collect the 1 star in Dire Dire Docks in order to access Bowser in the Fire Sea, which would give you access to everything else, which lowered the number of stars necessary to 16 stars. And then finally, thanks to the hard work of a ton of users actually on task videos, it was discovered that you could build up a backwards long jump through the 30-star door. It was a little bit complicated. It's a move known as a side backwards long jump, side BLJ. That's the term for it. It's just from casual observation, because I've never tried it myself. It looks like probably the more difficult of all of the backwards long jumps in the game. And you use that to break through the 30-star door, which lowered the number of required stars down to just 1, until finally in 2007 when there was a task released where the game actually clipped straight through the barrier for Dire Dire Docks, the entrance to Dire Dire Docks, straight into Bowser in the Fire Sea, which lowered the number of stars necessary to 0, which has actually been recreated by dozens of runners in real time. So there are actually categories for 0 star, 1 star, 16 star.
Yeah.
A lot of these different milestones actually became the foundation for the RTA categories that are known about today.
I'd like to just take the opportunity to give a big shout out to all the taskers in the world. We try and give credit for the fact that, you know, a lot of people see the top speedrunners of games and you know, give them all this credit, which they deserve fully. But there's so many people behind the scenes that make speedrunning happen, specifically people who are tasking and routing games that necessarily don't get recognized for that. And so when we learn about those things, we try and, you know, shout them out as much as possible. Unfortunately, there's not like, you know, some sort of documented history behind all of this stuff to always know who found what things. But the fact that, you know, there's all these people that are making tasks out on taskvideos.org and stuff. I mean, Chad and I have routed and speedrun plenty of games that nobody had run before, and our number one thing to do when we do that is first to go to task videos and see if somebody else, you know, has done that. So it's a huge contribution to the community and goes way too unrecognized.
Yeah, it's interesting because they don't really they don't necessarily see their work as being relevant to the RTA community, but it's interesting how much we do often depend on them for a lot of those discoveries.
Optimization.
I think we got a little freeze here.
From the cool. My Discord froze again. I'm back.
Go ahead.
So I think one thing to just sort of continue on about the any percent sort of progression. It's not humanly viable yet, but Tassers semi-recently actually found a way to beat Super Mario 64 using only one key. So right off the bat, they do a backwards long jump to get right into the vanish cap, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff that I'm not even going to try to explain because I probably wouldn't be able to articulate it that well right off the bat. So that they can basically get to the basement of the castle from outside right away.
Oh,
with the waters up.
Right.
So it's nowhere near humanly possible, but sort of the any percent, I guess the task versions has kind of recently been pushed down even more.
Yeah, I mean, currently, even with the 0 star, you have to do all the Bowser levels and fights. So being able to skip any of those, I mean, that's several minutes of time traversing through the level and then doing the fight.
Yeah, that one key task came
all
out.
You do in 0 star.
One key task came out 3 months ago, 4 months ago, something like that. And
it's been a while at this point, yeah.
That skips the whole first Bowser encounter, so that skips one whole key. So that's pretty significant in terms of progressing the game. I mean, it's. I mean, theoretically, whether or not it's possible to get up to upstairs without the second key, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, you could articulate why it shouldn't be possible just due to the way that the key doors actually act as proper loading zones for the castle. But I mean, it's only a matter of time until someone figures something out. It's kind of hard to like put a hard stop on it and say it's never going to happen.
Yeah, that goes. Like to say that. That's why, like, when people are excited about Odyssey and thinking like, "Oh," I mean, I was talking to someone, they're like, "Oh, well, the route's established, so we're good." I'm like, "Yeah, wait till 5 years from now. Like, this game's gonna look 1,000 times different." So,
yeah.
I mean, we're still finding stuff in games like this and Super Metroid, stuff that like literally hundreds of people of RTA run. We're finding things still, so it's pretty cool. I'm going to break down the world records real quick, but 120 star. So that's where you collect every star in the game without any restrictions. That has a world record of from Cheese 05. This is pretty recent and pretty big deal of a 139.28. The 70 star restricts the use of BLJs and MIP clips, so you have to get the minimum 70 stars that the game intends for you to beat the game. That's also a world record by Cheese 05 with a 47.56. The 16 star route, that restricts the use of the BLJ to clip through the 30 star door specifically, and kind of follows that old route like Chad was talking about. Xia, Xiah, is it pronounced Xia?
It's technically Shia.
Okay.
That's what I say, but everyone calls him Zaya. I call him Exa. Just it's like the opposite whenever people correct. So,
well, Shia has a 1524, and then the 1 star category has a 721. That's where you except for Dire Docs, you do what Chad was talking about. Then the 0 star world record is 644 by Akira. Other runners that appear high on leaderboards are Batora, Pumpcation, D whatever, and Simply. A lot of great runners throughout the history of time have run these, had records in them. It's been fun also, just to point out, a lot of people did this thing called Mario Hour a while ago, Lack Attack and Darbian specifically, where they tried to beat Mario 1, 2, 3, SMW in this in under an hour. And so it's cool to see, 2D runners trying to learn the 0/1 star category and be able to pull it off. But boy, good luck to you if that's the run you want to do.
Yeah, teaching an SMB1 runner to run SMB2 is one thing, but teaching them to run Super Mario 64 is certainly a horse of a different color.
I mean that was clearly the gateway to them getting the sub out almost every time, was like, can we get these BLJs even in a reasonable amount of time, let alone like what a RTA runner would actually do. It's crazy.
Yeah, I was extremely impressed with how quickly they were able to learn those skips. Like, I know SBLJ specifically is a very, very tough trick. So to see, in a matter of a couple days, they got it down
reasonably well.
Obviously
yeah,
good enough so that they could do a Mario Hour.
It
was.
Well,
Darbian was putting
different people.
Yeah, they were putting hours in, which is saying something for them because they pick up things relatively quickly. So the fact that it took Darbian 4 hours to get his first side BLJ is just like
Yeah.
that says a lot about the difficulty of that trick, to be perfectly honest.
Definitely. And it also seems like many runners stick to one end or the other of the spectrum, I guess, of runs. So a lot of runners are specifically 120 star and 70 star runners. So that's like the less glitched categories per se. And then there's a lot of people who stick with the 16 stars. There's less crossover than you actually might think. Is that accurate, would you say? Or
Um, yeah, like so I'm on the 120/70 part of the spectrum.
Mhm.
I like to play, I guess, the entire game, and I think the important part of getting good times in those categories is your movement, being able to move Mario quickly, not so much, like doing the glitches. It's a smaller part of it where 1610 they're way more optimized, and it's more about just nailing the glitches. Although obviously movement is important.
Sure,
Yeah.
but movement and a lot less levels, of course, too.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So, I don't think there's very much carryover personally. Like, I think 120 and 70 can help you a bit with 16 1 and 0, just kind of learning, how the mechanics work and stuff. But I don't think it goes the other way personally.
Yeah, I
It
you
would be a
definitely see
lot
that.
to learn
You
going
definitely
from
see that with a
16.
lot of bigger games. You won't necessarily see a lot of overlap between people doing 100% in Ocarina of Time versus doing any percent. You don't see a lot of people doing any percent in Super Mario World or 11 exit in Super Mario World versus doing 100 or 96 exit. So it does seem like in general speedrunners do tend to specialize in that way, which is I mean, that's something we've talked a lot about on this podcast. And then speedrunning used to be sort of this old man's game of playing 30 different games and playing
Being
them
a
all
Renaissance
reasonably
man,
well.
yeah.
And now speedrunning has become this arms race of like, do you want to be the world record holder in 120 star? Well, if you waste your time on 16 star, it's never going to happen. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, so there's a lot of tech to this game. I think the one thing that really shines through with this game when you watch it being played is that it's less, or at least for the longer categories. I guess I should say that what we're focusing primarily on is more in the vein of 70 star and 120 star for this discussion. But I think one thing that really shines through with this game is that it's less about specific minor tricks and it's more about understanding the nuances of Mario's movement, understanding how to do that tech properly. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you can actually move your Mario?
Yeah. So obviously there's different movement mechanics. Like, so you have your long jumps. It's usually what people do to accelerate at first because you can pretty much start it right away. It gives you some speed. If you already have speed, you can do things like rollouts, slide kicks, jump dives, that kind of stuff. And the most interesting thing about it is they basically they cover different amounts of distance. So you try to sort of chain them together in a way that you can cut all your corners as closely as possible and just kind of maintain speed. Like speed conservation is a pretty important thing.
Yeah, I'd imagine that's probably a big difference between mid-level runners and top-level runners. A top-level or a mid-level runner might understand how to do these dive, rollout, cancels to get maximum speed, but understanding exactly how much of each type of movement you need to hit like the exact mark you want to make it to in order to minimize the distance out of your way you're going is probably what really separates the top runners, I'd imagine.
Yeah, and just learning the timings for things like it's a lot of things like if you roll out on the first frame, Mario touches the ground, you maintain some speed. If you jump on the first frame after you land from a rollout, he maintains speed. And just kind of learning the timings and being able to chain everything together in a fluid manner, sort of with the right angles and stuff, can really save you a lot of time. And it's hard to notice almost if you don't, like if you watch someone say who has like a 145 and 120 star as opposed to Cheese who has a 139, a lot of sort of newer viewers won't really notice the difference because it's just so many tiny little things that are added in.
Yeah, we've had the luxury, those of us watching the video and watching the live broadcast of this, watching your PB along the way. And I mean, obviously, there's a few spots here and there where you'll see some large mistake or something, hit bonking a wall or something like that.
Yeah,
but in general, like it's the small nuances that none of us would ever notice. It's the small not understanding, if you had just, hit that rollout one frame earlier, maybe you would have kept a little more speed. Maybe if you'd hit the long jump at the right spot.
It's one of those death by paper cuts kind of runs where you're like you slowly bleed time through very, very small mistakes versus like, oh, I've got to pull off this one trick and that saves 20 seconds. You know, you're talking about second here, second there, and it just adds up.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I think now actually is kind of an interesting spot to talk about this, but I think that does represent sort of the fundamental difference between speedrunning a 2D game and a 3D game. You know, we don't talk a lot on this podcast about speedrunning 3D games because me and John are primarily 2D speedrunners. But
hey, I speedran The Grinch on PS1. Thank you very much.
And you did really great, and we appreciate you for it. But ultimately, I think that John and I would consider ourselves to be 2D speedrunners. And
if I could run in 1D, I would.
I think the thing is that I'm not going to sit here and defend 2D speedruns. I don't feel like I have to. I think that a lot of times 3D speedruns are viewed as more difficult and 2D speedruns are viewed as easier, and I think that there's a lot of truth to that, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of difference in sort of the degrees of freedom, but I think it's an interesting point talking about Super Mario 64 because Super Mario 64 being such a movement-heavy game, I think that it does become one of those instances of you can lose time in a run in the smallest of ways, but it adds up over time. Whereas with 2D games, it's a lot easier to understand how to optimize. Like, it's a lot easier to understand, you know, if I just jump at this exact pixel, then I will always take the same amount of time to beat this level. And so optimization becomes sort of this binary yes or no, I did it or I didn't do it thing. Whereas with 3D speedruns, I think that there's just so much nuance to it. And I think that that's really fascinating. It's a fascinating thing that we don't get to talk about enough on this podcast.
For sure. It makes them way more difficult than any of the 3D games that I've done. I mean, just knowing if your movement is, you know, there's so many more planes of reality to experience to do that. It's harder to know if you're on the right pixel or on the right, you know, path. What optimal movement has so much more range of variables to it. I guess I wouldn't say it's that much. I mean, it's hard to say, oh, this is harder or not harder, but yeah, it makes optimization considerably difficult. I mean, look at like even 120 star, like what is Cheese's sum of best versus his best time? I mean, like how much time could he save potentially? Like it's going to be a lot more than a 2D game.
I think it's something best is like a 137 like 13 or something compared to the 139.28 world record.
And that's a game that's run, you know, just as much as other games of the same length for 2D, but because of the just kind of the number of outcomes and the amount of, you know, like you said, it's not just a yes, no, I did it or didn't do it for 3D. There's, you know, I kind of did it. I should have been a little bit more on this angle or this degree. And
yeah, you hold an angle that's slightly different and you lose like 4 frames, but
but that adds up.
120 stars. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So I remember looking at your speedrun.com profile. You've speedrun Majora's Mask, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, I think I spent about a week and a half to 2 weeks on it.
Have you ever speedrun any 2D games, just out of curiosity?
So shortly after I learned Super Mario 64, I learned 11 Exit for Super Mario World.
I'm sorry.
I did a couple kind of just fun little races on it, and I don't know, I think so. The big thing, it's kind of hard to explain, but with Super Mario 64, I got absolutely spoiled with just like really good practice codes. Just you know, it's such an easy game to practice that when I try to move to other games, it's really hard to sort of have the patience to grind things out like I did in Super Mario 64. So I think
it's funny that you mentioned that because Super Mario World now has like that really stellar practice ROM.
Probably the best practice ROM of any game. But yeah, that's a good point. Like, I mean, it makes any game. Another unsung hero is people who work on stuff like that. People like Dots are cool, who set up these tools for people to practice on because, you know, that's why games like SM64 are so optimized, is because the way you're able to just like efficiently practice over and over again certain things, whereas other games, you know, you kind of just have to play the game till you get to that point or set up save states on an emulator. It's completely different.
Yeah, I think that sort of accessibility does really inform the sort of games that people really get into. I think it's funny that, you know, for instance, Ocarina of Time has had such a fantastic community, considering I don't think that they really have anything like that in terms of practice. Like, you can easily have a save file that you've already beaten Dodongo's Cavern. How are you going to go back and redo Dodongo's Cavern now?
Yeah, very, very recently they've just come out with a hack to practice. But yeah, until then, and even just, you know, in the recent times since it's come out, it's really skyrocketed some some pretty massive optimizations, and just a lot of people kind of coming out of the woodworks and picking the game back up that played it before. And
Sure. Yeah, that sort of thing can really promote a community. I mean, I know that Super Mario World really bounced back right after the really good practice ROM came out initially. That had a huge impact on it.
When's Barbie Game Girl practice ROM coming out? That's what I want to know.
The reason I asked about you speedrunning a 2D game is because, me and John have both done our middling attempts at speedrunning a few 3D games here and there, but he and I are primarily 2D speedrunners. And I'd say that your experience is probably the same in reverse, that you've done a few attempts here and there of some 2D games, but you're primarily a 3D speedrunner. It's just sort of interesting to get the perspective of, what's your idea about the difference between being a 3D speedrunner and a 2D speedrunner?
Yeah. So yeah, I did 11x. That's a tough one because I didn't really have any speedrunning experience when I learned it. Like, I maybe had put like, maybe a week or two into Super Mario 64 when I learned it.
Okay, well,
I recently actually tried to learn Super Mario Brothers any% for a 12-hour challenge.
Okay.
And I think I gave up after about 5 hours. So, it's very different, just in the sense where, like, 2D speed games, it's almost entirely just about timing, your jumps, that kind of stuff. Which, don't get me wrong, it's very difficult, and it's something I'm not used to. Where Mario, it's like, holding the right angles, and I think another kind of thing to note too is just with 2D games, there's a lot less room for mistakes because of it's easier to optimize, I guess, in that sense. So I don't know, I just find that since I started in 3D, I think it's hard for me to branch out when that's what I'm used to.
Yeah, don't let anyone fool you. 2D speedruns on a SNES controller are basically just DDR. It's just DDR for your hands.
Wow. That hurts.
Yeah.
That hurts.
So I mean, I think that there's a lot of appreciation for the speedrunning tech. I think one of the things that has made this game really stand out so much and accept its place in the speedrunning community is that nuance of movement. But there are a number of glitches that you see in both the short and the long categories. So we talked about things like backwards long jump, which the nuance of how that works is maybe outside the domain of this podcast, but the idea is just that you can build up more speed jumping backwards than you can forward. But there's also a lot of other little things, right? So we talked about the side BLJ. We talked about there's also the lobby BLJ is another one. What's the specifics of that one?
So that one, basically, as soon as you enter the castle, basically you can clip into a little pillar. If you remember as a child, there's 2 little pillars that each have 2 coins on them.
Mm-hmm.
Just in the main room, so you can clip into them, and then you do a BLJ, and then you can carry the speed straight into the first Bowser with 0 stars.
So that skips straight to the first Bowser without having to go into Bomb on Battlefield first.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So in a speedrun, it just saves you having to make 2 trips to Bomb on Battlefield, since you need the wing cap for some of the stars.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's also, I know not too long ago, it was probably within the past 2 years or so, a user named Sockfolder, who is really well known in the speedrunning community as being the guy you go to find setups for hard tricks. He honestly has a reputation that very much precedes him. But he actually came up with a setup for a trick that's called Cannonless. So what was the state of that trick before he came along?
Yeah, so there's a trick called Cannonless. Basically, it's an extremely precise ledge grab. There's a star in Whomp's Fortress called Blast Away the Wall, where you go into the cannon.
Sorry, I think we're frozen again here.
Yeah, I froze. I realized it.
That's okay.
So whereabouts was I when I froze there?
You were talking about, you can just start over about Cannonless.
Okay, yeah, so Cannonless, it's basically a really precise ledge grab. It's for a star called Blast Away the Wall, where you're supposed to basically get into a cannon, you shoot away part of the wall, and then you just get the star. But there's a tiny slit, and you get a ledge grab, and basically runners used to just run off a plank and hope they got it. And it just caused for an insane amount of resets, just because if you don't get it, you lose a ton of time. So that setup, at the expense of about 4 seconds of doing the setup. It's quite consistent now.
Yeah, we're sort of in a state now where you basically never see runners miss it. So yeah, that's a pretty neat. I remember back, watching back in the day, watching Sig Limmick do runs and just blasting out attempts of OG Cannonless. So he would do, Wump's Fortress as early as possible and then reset, and then do Wump's Fortress as early as possible and reset. And
yeah.
You almost, at that point, it's taken so many attempts to get a run going that you don't want to reset even bad runs, because it's like, now I'm going to have to go back to the 15 minutes of resets on OG Cannonless. So
yeah,
this was probably a huge boon for the community, if for nothing else, but just producing a consistent setup for it removed the stigma of resetting, which is probably really nice. There's also so in Shifting Sandlands, there's these 4 pillars you're supposed to use to unlock the pyramid, right?
Yeah.
And there's a way to get in without actually using those pillars, though.
Yeah, so you use the bob-ombs. I'm not going to go too in depth, obviously, because it's probably out of the scope of the podcast. But using a bomb, you can basically activate a glitch. So that while carrying a bomb, you can basically carry it to the pyramid. And if you go right where the part where like the bottom is, and then the top that comes off, and you ground pound, you can actually clip right into it.
Is that similar to the same trick you use in Bomb Bomb Battlefield to clip into the cage to get that star, where you're making the bomb look really big and then kind of clip your way in?
Yeah, you basically grab it right as it's exploding, and since the bomb's big, it tries to occupy the same space as Mario, and then they just kind of fight for a space, and it moves them backwards.
Oh, okay, cool.
That's kind of an interesting explanation for how that works. I remember trying to learn 16 star like when I was just getting started speedrunning, and my inability to even figure out how to even do the bomb clip made me just give up completely. I remember me and my girlfriend at the time, my girlfriend Skybills, we were both trying to figure it out. Like, we were like taking turns with the controller trying to figure out how to do the trick, and she got it, and I just walked away. I was like, nope, I'm done. Like, she can do it and I can't figure it out. I'm over this.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's definitely
it's not petty at all, bud.
I know, I am the most petty.
You're Tom Petty.
So there's a lot of other little things throughout. So there's clips in Tiny Huge Island and Tall Tall Mountain, right? I don't know exactly how those work, but you can see it in the speedrun. They'll like jump at a wall, and all of a sudden they're through the wall. But if I jump at that wall, it's a wall.
Yeah. There's the two there. It's just the walls are just angled in a certain way, and there's nothing behind them. So if you have enough speed, and you can dive at them, and just suddenly you clip through. And
I can't tell you the number of casual 120 star runs I've done where I say, I'm going to clip through this wall, and I just bonk against it 3 or 4 times before I finally say, fine, I'll play the level the way you want me to.
Yeah, I'll say, just as a general comment on the whole speedrun, because again, especially a game of this depth, we can't dive into, and the intent of the podcast is never for us to just dive in and do a tutorial of everything, but the way so many different stars are achieved outside of what the developer intended are so impressive. I mean, we could just list them, but like I think specifically of the one where you're supposed to like grab the owl and drop down into the cage, but instead you wall clip or wall kick off of the cage. And I mean, there's just so many unique routing touches to this game that it's just so fun to watch, and very frustrating to try when you say, oh, that looked easy enough, let me try and do that while I'm playing around, like Chad said, trying to clip through the wall, trying to do different things. And it's a hard game, but it's really cool to see just how this game's been routed and optimized to get all these different stars in unique ways. Super impressive to see people get all 100 coins like as quickly as possible. Like those are such frustrating stars to get casually, like when you have a timer running and you're like quote unquote trying to speed run it or whatever. Like just getting those optimally is so impressive, just all of it. It's something you gotta see if for some reason you haven't seen it, which would be weird, but you should.
So just to sort of wrap up this discussion, because it doesn't make sense for us to just list a bunch of glitches. There are a lot of really cool things in this game. I think this is one of those games that really lulls you into a false sense of I can do this, because I can't tell you how many stars I've tried to do in my casual 120 star plays where I've said, well, I've seen how this is done in the speedrun, and I won't be able to do it that efficiently, but certainly I can do something similar, and I cannot do something similar. I will just rip that band-aid right off. It's just not possible for you if you haven't practiced. But on that note, so let's say that you wanted to get into this game. If you wanted to get into 16 star or 70 star, 120 star, maybe the answer is different for all of them. How would you suggest people to approach this game? So what are the resources that are out there? What are the things you got to look into? Where would you start?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you go on speedrun.com and you go to Super Mario 64's page, basically, there's a lot of in-depth guides. I want to shout out actually Toast Rider 91. He made a guide for 70 and 120 star that basically has videos for every single star with, beginner, intermediate, expert strats. A lot of them actually have an input display as well. So that's a great place to start. I'd recommend obviously getting, maybe a Game Shark, or just do it on emulator or something where you can use practice codes that make it a lot easier. On top of that, we have a Discord where I'm in there pretty frequently answering questions, and there's a lot of other top runners in there that are, always helping out. Otherwise, yeah, just watch some speedruns if you like it. If you want to try it yourself, it has a good barrier to entry. Like it's easy to do your first run is the good thing about this game. Like the skill ceiling's very high, but if you want to learn, you can do your first 16 star run in probably a day or two.
Right.
Yeah, I'll say this, anecdotally speaking, I know like the first several years of speedrunning for me, I was really intimidated to get into this, like get into bigger games with bigger communities and stuff. It is cool because, learning a new game that isn't heavily run is pretty dependent on you to figure stuff out and do stuff. When you learn a new game like Link to the Past or this or whatever, there's such a breadth of like resources available for you, especially with the development of like speedrun.com and Discord, like being able to interact with other people. So many people have made like tutorials of different tricks or the whole run. I would say if you're intimidated to get into a game because of that, like there's a lot of also positives that come with a game being super run. Although you're not going to get world record, so just give that up right now. But
well,
outside
you're not
of
going to
that,
get world
just like
record yet.
yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I guess I can't say that. If you want to spend the next 3 or 4 years,
I mean, it
of your life
wasn't
focusing on it. You can.
It wasn't too
but
long
I'm
ago
not
that
making
video.
your first goal be world
Yeah,
record.
absolutely not.
Like that.
It wasn't too
Yeah,
long ago that video was circulating of Siglemic readying up for a race, and he said, "Who's this scrub? Doesn't he know he's going to get crushed?" And it was Cheese entering the
Yeah.
race with him and Puncation. It's like, doesn't he know he's going to get crushed by these two titans?
Yeah.
That's funny. That's funny. Yeah. So yeah. I mean, obviously, I didn't mean never get world record, but yeah, if your goal is, oh, I don't want to run this just because I probably won't get world record, don't shy away from games because of that, because I did that for a very long time. It's a lot of fun running games where you have active communities where you can race against people, where you have tutorials, you have discords, you have a lot of resources available to help you learn a game. Whereas if you just decide to route and learn your own game, there's a lot of challenges that come with that. So I don't know, that's just my short little.
So this is one of those games. So I'm sort of rounding out this discussion in a big way. This is one of those games that's actually done something very different than a lot of other games have done, and it's completely separated out version differences. So N64 does not even compete with Virtual Console, which doesn't even compete with emulator, and don't even get me started on IQ. It's its own meme thing. So like, how does that end up impacting the community? I imagine that each version has its own specific glitches and tricks, things that aren't going to work in one run, even whether or not it's a glitch or a movement, but just won't impact the speedrun in the same way. How does that end up working out? How is information shared between these little sort of sub-communities?
So I mean, really, it is all one community. The big differences don't come from the tricks you can do or not. It just comes from, so there's loading times and lag differences.
Okay.
Basically, VC has very fast loading times and no lag, so it is technically faster. I try not to comment on this too much because these decisions were made before I was a part of the speedrunning community. But
yeah, I'm not trying to force you into drama. It's interesting because a lot of games don't take this tack. A lot of games just sort of say play whatever's fastest, or play whatever language is faster or whatever.
So what happened basically was, it started out, the Japanese community started out speedrunning this game, and the Japanese version for VC is called the Shindu version, which is a remake. It actually had like Rumble Pack support and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, cool.
And there's a lot of stupid things about that version in terms of speed. So they went to N64 and they played on the console. So when people kind of started to join, from North America or Europe, they wanted to basically just compare accurately to Japan. So they ran on N64 as well. And then the standard just kind of got set that top runners eventually just switched to N64.
That's the same way that the timing rules happened as well, right? Wanting to compare with Japan, like this is one of the probably first games from basically the North American side that started timing from power on. That's just not really heard of in North American RTA rules.
Yeah,
or
that's
Western RTA
basically the
rules.
same thing. And as far as splitting up the categories, I wasn't around for those discussions, so I honestly don't remember what the motos were back then, or I don't know, but I basically just made it so that each console compares against people who run on the same console, since there's so many differences. It just allows for accurate comparison. I'm sure is kind of the big thing they said.
I think that makes sense. I mean, I think you want to avoid cutting out emulator. You want to avoid cutting out official releases of the game. But ultimately, if the top runners want to play on N64, then it's kind of silly to say, okay, well, the top runners are running on N64, and this guy that came out of nowhere now has a 2-minute better time because of faster loading times.
Because he's playing on the Wii U or something. Yeah, I appreciate that. I like separating those categories personally instead of forcing somebody to go, especially in a heavily run game where it's not like each leaderboard has 4 people on it or 2 people on it. Like, it's nice to be able to, not force people towards certain hardware. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. Just and you mentioned this. The differences are with lag. So I think if I recall correctly, I'm a layman when it comes to this stuff, but I think I recall one of the big differences is that the way you turn your camera and how that affects lag almost becomes a non-issue with like VC and emulator. But with
VC, there's none at all. On N64, almost every star on top of just the camera being hard to use, we also manipulate it to keep a lot of things off screen that would cause lag. And it honestly saves probably minutes throughout the run than if you just used a straight on camera. So
that's crazy.
Yeah, I've always found it fascinating.
Some players argue it's a good thing because it adds an extra element of skill. I personally, that's not my thought, but it is an argument that some people give.
Sure.
Yeah, I can understand that.
So, any last thoughts about the speedrun before we take a quick break and dive into Q&A?
I mean, I think that this is, I think a lot of games we talk about the appeal of running the game. We talk about how much fun it is to try the game out. If you want to try it, get into these resources and watch these videos and download these things. But I think a lot of times we kind of gloss over how interesting a game might be to watch. And I think this is one of those games that's just, even if you know nothing about the speedrun, even if you have never played the game even casually, I think that this is one of those games that's just fascinating to watch. It's fascinating to watch someone be good at anything. And this game, it's so easy to tell when someone is good at it and be able to see how impressive that actually is.
Yeah, I think that's the most fun game to like show to somebody that I'm trying to explain what speedrunning is to, that doesn't know anything about speedrunning and doesn't get it, to show them how cool it is, because most people are familiar with this game but don't know, like my casual friends might not know like what glitches look like and stuff like that, and it'll just blow their minds to see how quickly people are getting stars, climbing up TikTok clock, glitching out through the walls, and just it's such a fun run to watch. It's such a high level of skill for the top players, and it's just always a delight.
Yeah, being able to tell someone, what if I told you could beat the whole game in 7 minutes? It's just nothing compares to that face.
Yeah. So we're going to go ahead and take a quick break, and then since we are on Speedgaming live right now, we are going to be able to take some of your live Q&A. So as always, we're going to do some Q&A. We're really excited. These live episodes, we get a lot of great questions from you guys. We really appreciate all of your support. And again, if you do not follow Speed Gaming, check them out on twitch.tv/speedgaming. They also have Speed Gaming 2 and 3. Really awesome channels that help the community. Lots of tournaments going on. Just really cool stuff. The first question comes from Leon Piper from our Discord. If you want to check out our Discord, go to theframesavers.com. You can join our Discord and chat with us whenever you want. And it's where we get a lot of our Q&A on these non-live episodes. But he asks, for people who are interested in getting started with SM64 speedrunning, which category would you say is the most beginner friendly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's kind of two different answers you can give. You could argue either 16 star or 70 star. 16 is very fast to learn, and like you could do your first run in maybe 1 to 2 days, but it doesn't offer the same depth that 70 star does. So I guess almost depending on if your goal is eventually to run 120 star, I would recommend learning 70 first. You can learn that in a span of a few days as well. But maybe if you enjoy kind of the glitchy aspect and skipping parts of the game, 16 star is also a great category for beginners.
Yeah, I would assume this answer almost really just depends on what your goal is and what kind of speedrun you want to do, because the experience you get from running 70 star and playing all the different levels and stuff is it's just vastly different than doing 16 star. But would you say any of them are easier than others? Like, would you say if you're gonna learn 120, you should learn 70 first at least?
Yeah, I
And if you're
personally
gonna
would.
learn 0, you should learn 16 first.
Yeah. Well, 0 1 you almost learn together. 0 star, it's a very very complicated glitch, but it's in the same time or in the same way, it's almost similar to the 1 star one. I won't go too in depth there, but
Yeah.
either way, yeah, 16 star. Like, yeah, if you want to learn those, you want to get your foot in the door with 16, kind of to learn the glitches and stuff. If you want to learn 120, if you do that right away, it's kind of daunting.
Yeah.
It's usually good to learn 70, kind of get an understanding of the kind of the fundamentals of movement and stuff, and then move on to 120 eventually.
For sure.
Awesome.
Yeah, I definitely have an appreciation for the fact that there's an option for people who want a sort of organically glitchless category like 70 star. I mean, it certainly has its own glitches and tricks that are possible, but you can approach it in sort of from a glitchless mindset. If you just say, I don't really want to have to learn all of that stuff, you can just learn the rest of the game then.
Yeah, I agree.
So on our Discord, we had a question from Legs who asks, given the games that me and John run, I'd be interested to hear what draws some people to giant games, but other people to obscure unknown games.
Sure.
And I think that the answer for that is definitely different from person to person. I definitely view myself as more of a router in my role in the speedrunning community. I do runs as sort of proof of concept, and sometimes I will pick a game to actually speedrun properly. But for me, I pick more obscure games because there's more open room for me to flex that routing.
Sure.
Which is really what gets me into them. As far as what keeps me out of some of the bigger games is that they can be very daunting. They can't. It's hard to convince myself I want to learn a harder game if I know I'm going to have to invest the next month into it versus just investing the next 20 minutes into learning it.
Yeah, I would say that the reason that the giant games are giant are generally because they are beloved games in general. Like, you don't see a lot of really heavily run games that weren't also incredibly popular commercial releases. Like, the biggest games are Super Metroid and the Mario games and the Zelda games. It's not like Kid Cool is going to have 300 runs because it's got cool tech to it or something, So I think that's what draws people to the big games, is that they grew up on those games and they liked them so much and they want to learn how to play them quickly as well. I would say similarly to Chad, I mean, I'm not really big into the routing side of things like Chad is. I much prefer him to route a game and then me to get a better time, or somebody like him. But I like contributing to the community in a way of like just providing runs or different things for GDQs or for my channel that they're not used to seeing. And I've always just been a fan of weird stuff in general. And it kind of fits in with collecting as well, like obscure games that maybe you've never heard of. Part of what got me into this whole retro community was, hey, I've never played this game. Let's do that. It's not always just, I want to go back and play what I played as a kid. I want to find new stuff. And so a lot of times I find something cool and new on the Game Boy or the NES, and I say, you know what, why don't we do a run of it? Because it's not there. So yeah, but I think like Chad said, that the motivation is usually runner to runner, I would say. Dorkmaster Fleck asks us, why does SM64 continue to be one of the most popular speedrunning games? And similarly, Plasmodium asks, do you think the games will soon reach a dead end and stop being ran as much since it's been so many years since its launch?
Um, so I think a big reason it's continuing to be so popular is, at least obviously it was such a big game on release. And I think a good chunk of the people who watch it probably played it as a kid. Like the amount of people that come into my chat and say like, "Wow, you're doing this in 2 hours. I spent months on this game as a kid." Like,
Yeah,
I think I think it's just, it was such a popular game back then. It really has that nostalgic factor for a lot of people. And then those who also grew up with the remake, I think might also come across it. So it's almost a generational
for
nostalgia.
sure.
For sure.
Um,
Yeah.
I think games like this aren't ever going to be like, it's never going to stop having people run them, but it is interesting to see certain popular games hit lulls in terms of people running them and moving on to other games stuff. I think of like the Link to the Past community, like a lot less people I feel like run Link to the Past than they did 3 years ago, whether it be because of randomizer or just because, the route hasn't added anything substantially different in the last couple of years or what it may be. But I think this game always is going to be run a lot, especially these longer categories that have so much room for optimization still. Like you said, even though Cheese's run is like unbelievable, like his sum of best is still 2 minutes faster. So like it's possible to get a better time, whereas like something like SMB1, like it's really almost not possible to get a quicker time. So I think there's still room in this game for people to keep pushing for sure,
yeah,
as
Definitely.
hard as it may be. Because of the length. I mean, an hour and a half long run, it's not like it's going to be optimized by 10 seconds. Like that's just not really the experience of what speedrunning is. There's that human element that is going to make it still possible to make it better. So and
It
and this
is
game's always going to be so popular because it's such a great game and there's so many cool tricks.
it is definitely interesting to see people latch on to new releases and then see the way that and no criticism meant. I think that's fine. However, games experience their life cycle, but the way that they sort of naturally die off. So you've got games like
Mhm.
Breath of the Wild, which has definitely saw a ton of activity, and now
Absolutely.
you could argue that it's you know on a less firm footing than it was previously
Sure.
versus
And then
Super
you
Mario
look at
64.
Odyssey as like 5 million people running it every day, all day. Like, who knows what
And
that'll be like.
yeah, it looks like that one's going to have more legs, but who knows? Super Mario 64 is now coming up on 22 years old. It's just now 21 years old. Uh like it's doing great. No one's worried about it. It's
You
yeah,
also never know when people might move from a game like Odyssey back to a game like 64 who have never run a 3D Mario before, loved running Odyssey, now they want to run something similar. They might go to Sunshine or 64. So these games have weird life cycles. I mean, the obscure games especially have even more weird life cycles where you'll have 10 people pick up and learn a game 1 week and then nobody will run it for 3 years. So these popular games at least have more sustainability of like people are running them all the time.
for sure.
yeah. And another thing to note too is just like Super Mario 64 almost has like seasonal life cycles too. Like there's sometimes where there'll be a month where like almost no one's running it, and then
Mhm.
you see on Twitter everyone saying like, "Oh, Super Mario's dead," like no one's running it, and then a month later everyone's back to it. Like, um, and I think that happens with a lot of games.
Definitely.
Yeah, Super
I think
Mario
I
World's
think
been
Cola,
dead for
it'd be
2
pretty
years
difficult for it
despite
to
its
die
world
off.
record just improving like 2 days ago.
wow, which one?
The 96 exit world record
What?
got improved by
By who?
Louis.
What?
Yeah, you got like a
Uh,
122-21 or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, huge
I think
improvement.
also things like these tournaments on Speedgaming and other sites do help a good bit to keep games alive or refresh interest in them. Like I know specifically, I learned Link to the Past No Major Glitches because of the big speed gaming tournament that was a few years ago, and so like I know a lot of people picked up the game during that. So I think those things kind of refresh, breathe new life into some of these games that maybe are popularly run, but people kind of lose a bit of focus on. So it's
For sure.
cyclical.
Yeah. So Mr. Pizak asks on Discord, he says, with the popularity of Super Mario Odyssey and it being very similar in playstyle, do you feel like this could have a negative impact on the Super Mario 64 speedrunning community? Have you guys actually experienced any of this?
no, I don't think we have really. Like it's been kept pretty separate. Um, I think the one cool thing to note is there are some people who are pretty good at Super Mario 64 who are kind of taking their hand in Odyssey, and I think a lot of them are doing well. But at the same time, in terms of it kind of coming back and doing anything to the Super Mario 64 community, I don't think, at least as of yet, much has really happened.
I really could only see it being a positive down the road of people getting more into 3D Mario run, because outside of 64, like Sunshine has like a popular community, but not anywhere near 64. And so getting, people into other 3D Mario games could only end up down the road getting them into other ones, right? I mean, people end up picking up similar games on all the time for a reason. I mean, that's why you see the Sunshine runners and 64 runners running Odyssey. I think that'll have a backlash back the other way as well.
That's a good point, yeah.
Definitely. So Team Caffeine on Twitter asks, SM64 has 5 main categories and 18 category extensions. What are your favorite categories to watch or play? I actually want to hear BlueBob mention a category that's not one of the top 5. Like, tell us the unsung hero of the category list.
So in terms of category extensions, the only one I've actually run myself, I think I've done maybe 3 or 4 runs of a category called 45 star, which basically is just getting 3 stars in each of the main stages. So it's
that's cool.
It's pretty arbitrary, but it's a fun little category. My favorite to watch, actually, Todos los Rojos, or All Red Coins, actually had like a real spike in popularity for about 3 days, and it was a lot of fun to watch.
That's how it always goes.
That was the dream.
I love when a weird category gets a spike for like a week and then never gets revisited again. It's so great.
There's a lot of other ones. There's like 10 times canonless. There's just things like that too. But yeah, I'd have to say probably Todos los Rojos is actually a really good category.
That's cool though. I like the idea of having to get 3 stars in each world, because then you get to see each world, but you don't have to like you get to route out. I know that Professor Author Blues here would probably geek out on routing that out to be like which ones are faster, which aren't, because that'd be a fun routing exercise, honestly. Just like, and you don't have to get the 100 coins and stuff, but you still get to see every level. I think that's really cool.
And there's cool things too with that, where like maybe there's one stage where like like there's 2 stars that are faster, but maybe the 3rd fastest and the 4th fastest star are maybe like a second apart, but maybe like the 3rd fastest one's a lot harder, so maybe some players will opt to get like a completely different star.
Yeah,
it'll almost be at the same time.
That's pretty cool.
Definitely.
So our boy Bouncy Boy, shout outs to the Bouncy Boy of SMS fame, says, is it hard being a Canadian speedman? I hear that the cold can freeze your hands to the core, making it impossible to move Mario.
Yeah, it's actually really tough. It sucks, honestly, having to shovel out your N64 every time you go to play. By the time you get to play, your hands are frozen.
Oh man.
Yeah, we intentionally forgot to mention that you're Canadian. It's crazy, really, seeing the Canadian representation in the speedrun community. There's literally like dozens of you guys.
Yeah. I'm sure most of them notice whenever I say about or something like that.
But, I noticed.
Yeah, honestly, it's almost kind of surprising, like the population of Canada, almost like the ratio of like say Canada to the US. Like I feel like there's significantly less Canadian speedrunners.
Is it hard to smoke cigarettes and shoot moose while controlling Mario? That's my question.
Well, I just play with my feet, so like I'm
Okay.
shooting moose with one hand and then
nice.
Drinking beer and smoking both with my other hand.
Okay, good.
Going out for a dart.
So Squirrel3014 says, can Odyssey's secrets live up to SM64's secret?
Interesting. Yeah, SM64.
I don't necessarily know what
so
that means.
So SM64 just had like this storied history of like little hidden things, whether or not they existed or not, it was really irrelevant. I mean, the existence of Luigi or being able to find this or that in the game. But
stuff in 2017, Evan.
In Odyssey, there's no hiding stuff like that. But ultimately, the game does have a ton of actual secrets.
Yeah, I will be honest. When I read that, I first thought of like secret levels, so like the 15 secret stars. So I'll be honest, the answer I generated probably has nothing to do with the actual question.
So well, you can answer it anyway.
Well, what's your answer that doesn't have to do with the question? I want to hear it.
Well, my unfortunate answer is I haven't played Odyssey.
So oh no!
I can't say too much. I don't have a Switch yet.
So it's all be secret careful. To you.
Yeah, exactly. The secrets are a secret.
Yeah, be careful when you finally play Odyssey. You might quit SM64 forever, apparently.
That's a concern.
That's a very real concern. To Jericho asks, wonder if BlueBob was scared of the piano as a kid. I absolutely was.
Oh,
Of
I
course.
from the haunted level.
Yeah.
This question was very strange for me to read, not thinking of that context.
It took
I
me
thought it was
the
a
past
joke.
30 minutes of the podcast to parse it out, but I figured it out.
Like,
It's the podcast it's the piano from Big Boo's Haunt, and it was
Yeah.
terrifying to me as a child. I always knew it was going to jump at me. I didn't care. It still made me jump.
I
Actually,
watched
a fun
horror movies as a
fact.
kid. It didn't scare me. I'm sorry.
I
What?
got my bigger brother to do the entirety of Big Boo's Haunt for me because I was scared to do it.
That's the pro
awesome.
level strats.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Was your big brother Punkation?
Of course.
88 asks favorite stage as a casual player versus favorite stage as a speedrunner, including favorite star from that stage. And another person asks favorite stage.
So that's a tough one. I really can't say I have a favorite stage. There's a lot of stages that I like, but my favorite stages, you almost have a love-hate relationship. 'Cause, like, they're the hardest stages.
But that
So,
makes them the
like,
most
there's-
fun to run.
Yeah, if you do them well, like it's a ton of fun. But then there's other days where it seems every run you get there, you lose.
Are you talking about TikTok clock?
Yeah, TikTok clock, shifting sandland. There's a lot of hard ones.
That's interesting.
What about
So-
casually, like as a kid, what was your favorite?
So as a kid, I was a huge fan of Tiny Huge Island. Personally, I just thought it was really cool. I just liked the brightness of it, and then just the jumping in a pipe, and then the level being a completely different size. I thought was really cool personally.
My favorite was the snow level.
Wow.
I love the snow level. You race the penguin. I liked racing the penguin.
Yeesh.
I don't know. I like that level. It's fun.
Okay. All right. I'll accept.
Am I wrong?
So
I'm sorry. I'm wrong. I'm wrong. It's not my favorite.
that's
I'm
an
wrong.
absolutely wrong answer.
I'm sorry.
There are no wrong answers. There are just some answers that are more right than others. Like,
Okay. Mine's
Like-
the least right.
so my favorite level growing up casually was probably going to ultimately end up being Bomb on Battlefield because it's the one that I goofed off the
Well,
most in.
sure.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of hard to compare to it because it's not as easy to goof off in some of the other levels. In like a speedrun context, I can only talk about from watching it. But I definitely enjoy watching TikTok clock the most. Just the means by which you end up skipping the vast majority of the stage, climbing up that level is just
Oh,
really
yeah, to watch
fascinating.
It's awesome. That's my favorite to watch for sure. I will say, did your answer involve being able to throw a baby penguin off of the earth? And did your level prove flat Earth theory?
Did your answer prove flat Earth theory? Actually,
Have you seen the edge of the Earth when you're in the snow area?
that's
Have
fair.
you played Odyssey?
Flat Earth is real, man.
See,
That's-
I thought that, and then I saw Odyssey gameplay and realized it's actually round.
So I've got a few speedrun questions that I'm just gonna rapid fire at you. All of them from 88. He asks, "What's the hardest trick in the run to learn?" What would you say is the hardest one?
Probably for 120 star. I think my webcam just quit. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, well that's the big thing, I guess.
Your webcam gave up.
Yeah, it's actually
Too much
completely off.
handsome to capture in one
Oh.
piece of equipment. Can't handle it.
So I would say side BLJ, but I'm a 120 runner, so the hardest to learn is that. Honestly, I would say probably breezeless or pillarless. Breezeless looks really easy, but it's actually one of the hardest tricks in the game.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot going on there. It's there's a lot of different tricks that look really impressive. I think we've talked about this before on the podcast as well, that it's sometimes really sad that tricks that look really impressive are sometimes the easiest ones, and the ones that
Yeah.
are hardest to pull off are the ones that, I mean,
Like
they're
anybody can do. You can learn it in like a couple minutes.
yeah,
That's
sometimes
always frustrating.
The
Yeah,
baby
it's-
penguin's a notable one. Like every time someone sees that, they're like, "Oh my god, that was the coolest thing!" But it's actually so incredibly easy to do.
right. Yeah, some of that stuff ends up becoming trivial. So, biggest run killer. What's the biggest run killer, would you say, at least for your runs?
Well, I'm gonna take out Wom's Fortress because it's right at the start, so like you
Right.
reset there all the time. I would say just the basement portion of the castle as a whole is you have about 15 minutes straight where almost every star you do like is very hard and could
The
potentially
stand stars look so hard.
yeah, almost every star in that stage is
I
really
hate-
difficult.
It just stresses me out just watching it.
All right. So which star would you say is ultimately the most likely to kill off a run? That's a question from Calaria. Which star would you say, maybe separate from just your runs, maybe ones that you struggle with, but which would you say is the most likely to kill any, high level runner's run?
Um, that's a really tough one, to be honest. I
Is
would
there
say
any?
colorless is probably a big one.
Okay.
There's a lot of 100 coin stars too, where like you can just lose a lot of time, like without even dying, you can just lose like 20 or 30 seconds.
Yeah, that's tough because with the 100 coin stars, they're sort of stacked on top of each other. So
Yeah,
it's almost by no fault of the actual star that it becomes a challenging star.
yeah, that's exactly it.
Right. So Scatter asks, what's the most hype moment in a run?
Um, I'm gonna have to say there's a trick called HMC BLJ. Um, it's fairly new and it saves about 7 seconds, and it's a really long BLJ that you hold. Um, well, it's fairly new in runs, and when there's only a couple runs that did it, and whenever Cheese would get it, I would say that would cause the biggest reaction out of chat and that kind of stuff. Because if you fail it, you pretty much lose the run, and if you get it, obviously it looks really, really cool, and it's hard, and the run continues.
Awesome.
The run continuing is good.
Mm-hmm.
Mythical 9 asks a good question. What do you think about the enemies in SM64? How well were the Mario staples like Goombas and Thwomps reintroduced in 3D? And then what unique enemies never caught on in future games? I would say I think it introduced the enemies pretty well. I mean, they're very noticeably Goombas and Koopas and Alakatu and stuff like that. But there are a lot of enemies that never really caught on in future games, right? I mean, I think of them as generic enemies, but I mean, I think of them as generic because they weren't reintroduced. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
but then there's also like there's no dry bones.
yeah,
One actually fun fact. I apologize for my lack of lore knowledge, but in
gotta respect the lore.
Super Mario World, what is the little red dragon that lives in the lava? Do you know
Oh,
his name?
Blarg.
Blarg, that's it. So they actually made a model for Blarg to
Oh
be
wow,
in Lethal Lava Land,
Okay.
but it never ended up making it in.
that would have been
Interesting.
cool. I think of like there's so many generic like there's a lot of penguins. There's a lot of penguins that don't show up anywhere else. I love penguins though. There's those guys that you jump on their heads and you spin in a circle in
Spin
the ice
drifts.
level.
Oh,
Yeah,
the
those will
eyeballs.
never show up again. I mean there's a lot of weird enemies in this game. Like
I
the
think
spiders that skip on the water, the things that throw you in the air like you said.
Nintendo's been really interesting about you think that they forgot completely about something and then it comes back much later. I know that one gripe that I had for a long time was I was always really disappointed that it felt like they more or less forgot about the chucks, charging chucks and things like that.
And then they're in Odyssey, yeah.
And now they're in Odyssey. So it's like,
random.
what am I complaining about?
Or they like throw it into like Mario Tennis 5 or something
Right.
like that. You're like, oh, I haven't seen that character. I can play as him. Like obscure tennis game. Like it's so
Right.
weird. Like they know the lore. Don't think
you
they
can
don't.
you can play it on Mario is Missing for the Game Boy Color, but only if you play it with the Game Boy Advance enhancements. It's like oh okay, got it. That's where it went. So Melwing Games asks, is there a difficult transition for Mario 64 runner if they start on emulator and then later switch to N64 console?
Not really, to be honest, but I would say that the earlier you do it, the easier it is. I personally switched when I think I had like a 106 in 70 star, and it took me maybe a week to get used to things and kind of get around to where I could, I guess, PB again. The recommendation I always give people is like if you don't have an N64, start on emulator. See if you enjoy it, and if it's something that you're gonna put enough time into to make it worth the investment. The earlier you can switch from there, probably the better if that's what you want to do.
Sure. I will say as a collector, I mean N64s are pretty cheap. You can get them for like $40 usually.
Yeah.
I mean the game's like $30, 25, $30.
If you want to play in
So
Japanese, you can get a cartridge from Japan for like $10 with
yeah,
free
they're
shipping.
always way cheaper.
Yeah.
I mean the only expense that we'd really go into it is if that you wanted to run on like a Hori controller, because I know they have a much nicer N64 controller. That's like $100, but yeah, I don't know. It at least is not that much barrier of entry, but there's no shame in like trying something on emulator for a while just to make sure that you're committed to doing it before you buy a bunch of stuff.
I think for retro speedrunners, that's relatively common. I know I started on emulator. I know a lot of people started on emulator, and finally you decide if I'm going to invest this much time in it, I should have the proper hardware and do
And
it
if you're
properly.
newer to speedrunning in general, then you don't have to buy a it just makes things considerably easier to do as a first comer.
For sure. All right.
Any more questions that we want to do?
No, I think I'm good for right now.
I want to ask one that's in here. Real talk for a minute from Slice Mage. Between Author Blues and BlueBob, who is bluer?
It's rough.
His shirt is blue, I think.
Have you seen my eyes, though? You could fall in love with my eyes.
Yeah, my eyes are brown.
Just saying.
My dad says my eyes are brown because I'm full of something.
That actually makes perfect sense. So, if anyone were to want to watch some fantastic Super Mario 64 speedruns, where could they find you, Bob?
They could find me at twitch.tv /BlueBob. There's nothing
Nice.
else.
Do you have anything else you want to plug? Any of your other various accounts of anything?
Tinder account.
Just type here. My Tinder, unfortunately, I haven't gotten the verified link yet, but once that happens, yeah, my Twitter is BlueBobSRL.
Nice.
Yeah, I need to get that name changed down too, but no, yeah, that's probably about it. I stream usually kind of in the mornings, but I'm trying to kind of switch that up, so we'll see how that goes.
You getting that prime time Europe slot?
Yeah, that is it.
Yeah, but then you got all those Euros in your chat causing trouble.
You know, there's a reason why they don't listen to our podcast, and it's probably about 50% because we don't talk about Sega games, and about 50% because we talk bad about Europe. It's really hard to nail it down exactly. If you want to find out more about our podcast, though, you can check out www.theframesavers.com. We have our links to pretty much everything relevant on there. If you want to find us on Twitter, we have a Twitch account. We'll probably start doing more live episodes there eventually. All of those things are The Frame Savers, so twitter.com/theframesavers, twitch.com/theframesavers. You can also find our Patreon at patreon.com/theframesavers. Through you guys' generous support, we're able to do pocket episodes. So you see this episode right here, we've been running for about 2.5 hours. We do a lot of shorter episodes on off weeks as well. So we do about a 30-minute episode on smaller games that may not have enough content for a full episode, but games that we still want to be able to give proper love to. And so we do smaller episodes there. And it's through those generous contributions that we're able to make that happen.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for that. That helps us pay for our hosting fees, pay for our editing, and just keep running. We don't really actually get any money from it personally, but it keeps the operation going, and anything extra we try and put into like advertising or something to try and, get word out there about the podcast. So thank you. I'm going to give a special shout out to our $25 a month patrons who help us do that and pay for those fees. We've got Tina Hacks, who was on our last episode that is going to release, I think, in 2 days on Shantae and the Pirate's Curse. You can find her on twitch.tv/Tina Hacks. She does FF6, she does SMW, she does a lot of different speedruns and just makes really great content.
Those of you who are watching the listening to the audio episode are going to be very confused by that. For the live watchers, sure, it's coming out in 2 days, but for the audio, it came out 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago. Yeah, sorry about that. So it'll have existed at some point for all of you. So as long as you live another 2 weeks, you'll be good. You can also follow Mr. Pizak. That's MRPZAK at twitch.tv/Mr. Pizak. He does NES speedruns of a variety of things, so definitely give him a follow as well. You can find Chad where can we find you doing hot, fresh, kid cool speedruns 24 hours a day?
Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, and plenty of fish at Author Blues. And how about you, John?
You can find me on Twitter, Twitch, and Christian Mingle at John Carls. You can find me on YouTube at John Carls1. Also, a huge shout out to Brian Morgenthaler. He's our producer. He's the reason why this podcast continues, because neither of us would edit it and we would have given up a long time ago. Give him love at BMorgs TV on Twitter and Twitch. Sometimes he streams horror games with his wife. Lately, he does not, so go yell at him on Twitter to do that. Any last thoughts about SM64?
If you don't know about SM64, I don't know how you live in the speedrunning community. You can't avoid it. You can't run from it.
I recommend playing it, and thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you so Speedgaming again for having us on live. Follow them at twitch.tv/speedgaming, speedgaming2, and speedgaming3. They're taking over the world. And thank you guys so much again for listening. Have a great week.
Peace.
Yeah, thank you guys very much for having me. I appreciate it.